Blog Talk Radio.
Bichamo Afurakani Afuraitkaitnit Ojira da Medinde Ojirafo Kwesi Nehem Ptah Akhan. Akwamuman Amaruka Atifi Ojirafo. That means greetings to all Afurakani Afuraitkaitnit people, meaning Africans, black people. Today is Ojira Day, Purification Day. My name is Odwirafo, Kwesi Nehem Ptah Akhan. Ojira of the Akwamu Nation in North America. Yet I say we thank you for tuning in once again today, tuning into the broadcast. For individuals who are new to the broadcast, we have 3 broadcasts on a weekly basis. On Jorda, Monday nights, we have Akhan for Nanasom, Ancient Authentic Akhan, Ancestral Religion, where we deal specifically with the Akhan expression of ancestral religion, in detail dealing with Akhan philosophy, culture, ritual practices, cosmology, and so forth. Number 1, because we are Akhan. Number 2, because of the misinformation that has been propagated by infected Akhan folk on the continent who have been infected with Christianity and Islam and white culture in general, white pseudo-perverse culture in general, which has infected their practice, and therefore the information they share has been tainted, been polluted, been corrupted, as well as individuals in the Western Hemisphere who purport to practice Akhan spirituality, Akhan religion, but have again been infected by white culture, and therefore they have promoted misinformation in a pseudo-Akhan cosmology, philosophy, and ritual practice based on that infection. So we bring forward accurate information, ancient, authentic Akhan ancestral religion, rooted in our ancestry going back to ancient Khanat, the Khanit land, which is ancient Nubia. Title of ancient Nubia is the Khanat land, or the Khanit land, and the Khanit people is the title of the ancient people of Khanit or Nubia. We migrated from ancient Khanat, reestablished Ghana or Akhana in the western part of the continent of Afuraitkaitnit over 2,000 years ago. About 1,000 years later, we migrated from the ancient empire of Akhana or Ghana and reestablished Akhan or Akhana civilization in the forest belt in the regions of Ivory Coast, Cote d'Ivoire, and what is today the Republic of Ghana. And a few hundred years later, some of our people were taken from that region and forced into the Western Hemisphere during the Kwesi, the great enslavement, perversity enslavement era. And this is how we arrived in the Western Hemisphere by and large. So we show that not only that migration of people, but migration of culture, migration of ancestral religious practices that has been maintained everywhere we have migrated or been forced to migrate around the world. And of course, the Akhan tradition continues in the form Obia in Jamaica and Kwesi in Suriname in South America, as Kudu in North America amongst Afurakani Afuraitkaitnit people in North America. So we go into detail about that. On Wednesdays, or Wukuda, we have Egua Marketplace there. And we deal with Afurakani Afuraitkaitnit businesses, organizations, and institutions. We are in the midst of our Okom Economic Development Model operation. We have published the Okom Economic Development Model, which is a model of economic development, short, medium, and long term, rooted in Afurakani Afuraitkaitnit ancestral religious values. We have published that model, and part of the operation, putting that model in operation, is our strategy to starve the beast and feed the pride. We are targeting one business organization or institution per week for 15 weeks. We are on week number 16, for 52 weeks rather, we are on week number 16. When you look on the Okom Economic Development page, you will see the various businesses, which is a growing list that we have supported as a community, and we ask all Afurakani Afuraitkaitnit people to support the various businesses, but we're targeting one business organization per week for 52 weeks. On the Okom Economic Development page, you will see those businesses, the links to their website. You will also see the links to the interviews that they did with us on our Egua Marketplace show, where they sat with us for 2 hours to talk about their background, their business, organization, institution, their philosophy behind serving the Afurakani Afuraitkaitnit community in a positive capacity and how their ancestral religious values inform their service to the community. So we'll put the link for that in the chat room, the Akwamu Economic Development page. Right now, if you are on the phone line and you have a question or comment, hit the number 1. If you are in the chat room and you have a question or comment, you must log in as a user in order to interact in the chat room. If you don't have a username, you can log in. You can create one very quickly in Blog Talk. Okay, so we also, of course, today is Benada, Abenada, Tuesday, and we have Ojira. Ojira Da, or Ojira Day, Purification Day, and this is the name of the show. Also, of course, the name of our Blog Talk channel in general. Ojira meaning purification. Jira means purification. In the Akan language, it also means a celebration of purification. So therefore, for many Akan folk, our New Year's celebration, a 7-day celebration which takes place for Akan folk on the continent around August, September, or October. For Akwamuman, Amaruka, Atifi, the Akwamu nation in North America, we observe our New Year's celebration, our 7-day New Year's celebration in September, between September 16th to the 22nd, or September 17th to the 23rd, depending on the year. For the first full day of the Atimet equinox, or the autumn equinox, the first full day of fall is the first day of our new year. And of course, September 22nd this past year was the first day of our new year. So September 22nd marked for us the beginning of 13,015, a few months prior to the beginning of the European pseudo-New Year, which they start at January 1st, when everything is dark, dead, cold, and lifeless. Then they yell out, Happy New Year in the middle of the night. Of course, that is a caveman, glacial practice that has nothing, no basis in reality. Of course, when the beginning of the day is sunrise. The beginning of the time of the year, it includes sunrise within the second half of the year. You have spring equinox, which is going through the autumn equinox, that is the warm half of the year. And you have the autumn equinox going back through to the spring equinox, that is the cooler half of the year. Once you reach the autumn equinox, that is similar to sun setting, the sunset. That is also akin to a seed being planted in the ground. When the sun goes and sets into the ground, so to speak, it is akin to a seed being planted in the ground. It is the end of the warm part of the day, and with regard to the year, the end of the warm part of the year is the time for the harvest. To harvest all the things that you have cultivated and developed throughout the year. It's harvest time. So this is why we have the New Year's celebration in September. It's time to harvest, but it's also a seeding time. It's the end of one cycle and the beginning of a new cycle. In the harvest and the gathering, but also the seeding, the conception. So that is Jira, meaning purification, Ojira, a celebration of purification. In the language of ancient Kemet, Jira means purification, and Jira also means a celebration of purification. So it's the same term directly from our ancient ancestors and ancestors of ancient Kanat and Kemet. So we deal with Ojira on Benada, Abenada, Tuesdays. Ojira, purification, as we say, operationalizes Nanasom, operationalizes Afurakani, Afuraitkaitnit, or African Ancestral Religion. Nanasom is our catch-all term, general term for Afurakani, Afuraitkaitnit, African Ancestral Religion in general. No matter what expression that takes, your religious practice takes, whether it's Akan or Yoruba, Ebe or Fon, Basa or Fula, Chokwe or Lobi, or Chiluba, or Baluba, or Bakongo, no matter what form your ancestral religious practice takes. Also in the Western Hemisphere, Hoodoo in North America, Juju in North America, the Gullah Geechee tradition in North America, Voodoo in North America, as well as in Central America, South America, the Caribbean, wherever we are, no matter what form our practices take or what expression they take, they are all, we refer to them all as Nanasom. the ritual incorporation of divine law and the ritual restoration of divine balance, expansive pole and the contractive pole of ancestral religion. In essence, through ritual, we incorporate those things, objects, deeds, and entities we need to incorporate in order to harmonize our thoughts, intentions, and actions with divine order. And through rituals, we restore balance to our lives by rejecting, repelling, hating those things, objects, deeds, and entities we need to reject, to repel, to hate, in order to restore balance to our thoughts, intentions, and actions, and restore balance to our lives. So therefore, the expansive and contractive poles of ancestral religion is the ritual incorporation of divine law and the ritual restoration of divine balance. That is nanasom in essence. So purification, Ojira, operationalizes nanasom. Purification operationalizes the process whereby we engage ritual to incorporate law and engage ritual to restore balance to our lives. So we show in Ojira, on Ojira Day, how ancestral religion impacts every aspect of our lives, thoughts, intentions, and actions from moment to moment, day to day, month to month, year to year, lifetime to ancestral life to lifetime. As long as we are incorporating law and restoring balance so that we can harmonize our every thought, intention, and action to divine order, we are engaged in ancestral religion. We're engaged in nanasom. And since we live in that fashion, we are engaged in nanasom in every aspect of our lives when we are focused, when we are awake, when we are aware. So this is what we deal with on Ojira Da, and we clarify concepts, clarify cosmology, clarify conception, clarify perceptions about ancestral religious practice and the nature of Afurakani, Afuraitkaitnit people in relationship to the Great Mother and Great Father, NKWAMUA and NHOMA, Amen, the Supreme Being, our relationship to the Abosom, the Orisha, the Bodu, the Untoru, the forces in nature, our relationship to the Nananum, Samanfo, the Egungun, the Kubita, the Muo, the ancestresses and ancestors who are spiritually cultivated, as well as those Samanfo, those good ancestresses and ancestors who may not have been cultivated, but they were still people who were good people fundamentally nonetheless. So those classes of ancestresses and ancestors, as well as the nature, spirit, and so forth, our relationship to creation, eurasian, the created world. We talk about how purification operationalizes our interaction with the spiritual forces that animate creation, as well as those ancestresses and ancestors of our direct blood circle. We talk about in detail how our ancestral religious practices derive directly from our ancestresses and ancestors as they have been informed by the forces in nature, the Abosom. We are born into the world assigned to specific Abosom, created and assigned to us by the Supreme Being. So before we even enter into the womb, we are assigned to Abosom, are sent into the world with those Abosom assigned to us, including the Abosom that governs our Kra, or Krawa, our soul, our divine consciousness, the divinity that dwells in our head region and guides us throughout the course of our lives when we align with that force in nature, that male or female force in nature, called Ori, Inu in Yoruba, and Selido in Vodun, and the Chi in Igbo, we call it Okra, the male force in nature dwelling in the head region, or if you're a female, Okra or Okrawa, the female force in nature, a divinity, a personal Abosom dwelling in the head region. Therefore, we come into the world assigned to Abosom. We come into the world also with specific Nananum Nsamampo, spiritually cultivated ancestresses and ancestors of our direct blood circle who have been assigned to guide us throughout the course of our lives. They do not live our lives for us. They do not do the work for us, but they give us proper direction so that when we act, we have the option of acting in harmony and comporting ourselves in harmony with Nyamewa, Nyame, and Sheshe, or divine order. So, because we have the Abosom assigned to us pre-incarnation, we have Nananom Nsamanko assigned to us pre-incarnation. That means we come into the world with Nanasom, with ancestral religion when we are born into the world. And of course, we're born into a culture through a blood circle, and when our people recognize our own culture, our own inherited transcarnational culture and identity, then we seek to nourish those returning ancestresses and ancestors in that culture and raise them up in that culture or way of life so that we can manifest Odwirafo, or ethical existence. So this is key to understand that we're born into the world with a culture, because that informs the way that we comport ourselves and the way we carry ourselves. It informs the manner in which we begin to reincorporate ancestral religion and not making ourselves foolishly and naively dependent upon people outside of our direct blood circle for instruction on ancestral religion, whether they are from the continent or whether they are from the Caribbean or anyone outside of our blood circle. Your ancestral religion comes directly from your direct blood ancestresses and ancestors directly to you. They dispense the tumi, the power of the abosom, directly to you, genetically, spiritually, spirit-genetically. And they transfer the culture as well directly to you. This has always been the case. Other individuals who we are related to, cousins on the continent, cousins in different parts of the world, our Afurakani, Afuraitkaitnit world community body, then we are peers. It's not a master-slave relationship. It's not a parent-child relationship. We are peers. We are cousins. We are equal. We need to recognize that. Then we move forward in a harmonious fashion. Now, what we want to get into tonight, you notice the name of the topic, the name of the show, The-rapist or The-rapist. Afurakani, Afuraitkaitnit, Ancestral Religion versus quote-unquote psychology. So we have a number of individuals who go through the process of becoming therapists, social workers, case managers, community support workers, psychologists, psychiatrists, sociologists, all kinds of forms of human services agents. Those of our people who are somewhat aware, they recognize immediately that once they begin to study sociology, once they begin to study psychology and the various definitions and the various processes that they are given and the modes of therapy and therapeutic models that are put forward, it's all rooted in white pseudo practices. And they begin to recognize this is misinformation and it does not serve our people well. So the people who understand that just on a fundamental level, they'll go through the process, get certified and so forth, but once they get their certification and then they begin to deal with their clients, they operate and deal with their clients in an intelligent fashion based on their own ancestral culture, even if it's instinctive, even if they don't know necessarily exactly the way to move, but they know it's not following behind these European pseudo psychologists, sociologists, psychiatrists, and so forth. Some of our people are enamored with the whites in their offspring, however. So they therefore think that the whites in their offspring have the keys to psychology, the keys to therapy, the keys to psychiatry and understanding neuroscience and cognition and perception and everything else. In reality, we're going to expose that nonsense. Tonight, we're going to show the differences between pseudo-psychology and ancestral religion. It is the domain of the priests and priestesses of Afuraitkaitnit, and it has been that for thousands of years. This notion of psychology or psycheology, the science of the psyche or the science of the quote-unquote soul, that the whites in their offspring label this quote-unquote field of endeavor, the science of the quote-unquote soul as well as the spirit and the different aspects of our spiritual anatomy, and attending to those different aspects is the domain of the priests and priestesses. So let's look at a specific class and title of priests and priestesses in ancient Kemet. If you look at the term therapy or therapist, of course, if you break it down, it can become the rapist. So you don't want to become the rapist. You want to be a quote-unquote therapist. So what's the difference between therapist and the rapist? You're dealing with the whites and their offspring and their pseudo-culture. Now you're raping and polluting the minds of our people, polluting the spirits of our people, filling them up with pseudo-psychology, pseudo-approaches to behavioral modification. And then our people continue this path of self-destruction, self-destructive activities, and so forth. If you look at the outcomes, for example, with regard to people who, in our community, who are seeing therapists over the course of decades, what are the outcomes? If you visit people in psychiatric hospitals, if you visit our people in the psychiatric ward of hospitals, you visit our people in mental health clinics, behavioral health clinics, if you see clients in various therapeutic settings and so forth, what are the outcomes when they deal with, whether it's non-Black therapists or Black therapists who are rooted in pseudo-psychology, eurasian pseudo-psychology? What are the outcomes with regard to our people? Are they really being helped, or are they just simply being medicated with these psychotropics so that the therapist can continue to feed off of them, eat off of them? As long as their mood is maintained, or basically they're made to be numb with these psychotropics, or if they're simply made to be numb with these pseudo forms of psychology and these behavioral modification techniques that they're given by their therapist, simply keeps them coming back because they've never really improved their condition. When you look at that, you must scrutinize, you must make a proper assessment and recognize that our people are really not being helped by this pseudo-psychology. So then we need to go back. It's no different than a diet. If our people have been eating deep-fried foods and a great deal of salt and all these different things that we're being fed by the whites and offspring ever since enslavement up until this very day, generation after generation after generation. When we look at our people, we have high blood pressure, diabetes, emphysema, heart disease, a number of different problems, a number of different medical problems, most of which are avoidable, most of which are preventable. Once we look at the state of our health, it doesn't matter how much technology has advanced, how much we foolishly believe that we have advanced politically. We have not advanced politically if we're not free and independent on our own land and defending our sovereignty, self-ruling and self-governing. Until we attain that, then we have not advanced. We're no closer to that today than we were 100 years ago. So there has been no political advancement. Don't let the whites and offspring fool you. And of course, we put in place Ama Ancestral, the 7 principal values of Ama Ancestral and nation building restoration, so everybody can recognize their part in the nation building process and begin to work on that based on their energy complex, based on their nature as an Afurakani, Afuraitkaitnit individual in the world, and their specific energy complex, and they begin to align with one or more of those principal values of nation building and work on that consistently in concert with other people who are on the same page. But just like we have not advanced politically, we have not advanced with regard to our health. So when we look at our health, we look at the nature and the state of the health of Afurakani, Afuraitkaitnit people in America, for example, we are suffering from all kinds of diseases, suffering from all kinds of vices, suffering from all kinds of addictions, whether it's illicit drugs and so forth, or if it's food addiction. We're suffering from these things, and we're engaged in self-destructive behavior on a daily basis. When you look at that, then you have to make an intelligent decision. You have to say, well, what were we doing before we embraced the whites and their offspring definition of what it means to be healthy, what we need to put in our bodies, what's important, what do we value, and so forth. And we began to recognize that we need to reject these patterns of eating and food consumption and so forth that have been forced on us by the whites and their offspring. And then we go back to something that's primordial, something that's primal, something that's rooted in our nature. We start going back to plant-based diets and so forth, getting rid of all of the nonsense that the whites and their offspring forced upon us. And then we realized we began to change our health and improve our health and bring balance back to ourselves. In the same fashion, when we look at what's going on with the mental health of Afuraitkaitnit people, where the people are engaged in suicidal ideation, and people are suffering from so-called major depressive disorder and anxiety disorders and abandonment issues and anger and road rage and all kinds of things our people are suffering from, and they typically medicate themselves. They medicate themselves with food. They medicate themselves with drugs that are actually destroying them, whether it's marijuana, which is, of course, is a very dangerous drug. Although the whites in our offspring would like to brainwash melanin-dominant people otherwise. We've dealt with that in a separate broadcast. Marijuana, alcohol, and other various drugs. We're self-medicating to hide what's going on mentally, spiritually, because of this spiritual discordance. And white psychologists and psychiatrists, therapists, as well as black psychologists, psychiatrists, therapists, do not have an answer for that. And psychology is not designed to give you an answer for that. It's designed to keep you enslaved. It's designed to keep you in a position where you can be controlled, where your behavior can be predicted, to make sure that you don't seek to embrace yourself, embrace your people, become independent, and move forward in an independent fashion. So you don't want to be a therapist or the rapist. You get back to what is a therapist? What is it in reality? What is it from the beginning? Where does the word even come from? So when you look at the etymological origin of the term therapy, you'll find that the whites in their offspring will tell you that the origin is actually unknown. They'll give you a few pieces. For example, if you pull up Etym online, we'll pull that up just to read it right quick for you. etymonline.com. You look at the term therapy, and of course, any etymological dictionary, you'll find the same piece. Medical treatment of disease, from the modern Latin therapia, from the Greek therapia, curing, healing, service done to the sick, or waiting on service, from therapeuin, to cure, treat medically, literally, attend, do service, take care of. Then it says see therapeutic. When you go to therapeutic, it goes back to therapeuticos or therapeutin, to cure, treat medically, primarily, to do service, take care of, provide for, of unknown origin, related to therapon, meaning attendant. That is all they can give you. Now, of course, when they say unknown origin, and you find these roots of these various words in European languages, you'll find that these words are stolen, taken directly from our ancient languages. When they say it's of unknown origin, they don't properly trace it back to ancient Kemet, ancient Kanat, because they don't want us to understand that these are terms, various terms, the root terms in all European languages and so forth, coming directly from our ancestral language. Because if they were to teach you that, then you would have to reassess everything you've been taught about white culture and language and pseudo-religion and philosophy and everything else. So when they say unknown origin, therapy, therapon, therapeutin, meaning attendant, to do service, take care of, provide for, and then later on curing and healing and so forth. Where does thera and therapon, where does that come from? Some people will say, well, there was a Jewish sect called the Therapeutes, and they were healers, and they were sacred healers and so forth. Of course, and then brainwashed Negroes will say, well, that has something to do with the fictional cartoon character Jesus, who never existed, and saying Yeshua was one of the Therapeutes and all of that nonsense. We did a broadcast on not only Asar, Aset, and Heru, but we also did a broadcast on the deity Shensu Neferhetep Heru. That is a different Heru divinity. Shensu is the son of Amen and Mut. Amen, the great father, the supreme being on the male side. Mut means mother, but Mut is a great mother divinity. She is not the great mother divinity. The great mother divinity is Amenet, and the great father divinity is Amen. But Mut is another mother divinity, and her name Mut literally means mother, and Mut-er and Mot-er became mother in the English language. The root term is Mut. Amen and Mut give birth to Shensu. Shensu is corrupted into Shensu, Yesu, Yeshu, Yeshua, Yeshu, Yisho in Syriac and so forth. This is where you get the title of the fictional cartoon character Jesus from. Kensu Nefer Hetep Heru. He's a Heru, or hawk-headed divinity, just like Heru, son of Asar and Aset. So Heru, son of Asar and Aset, the entire life cycle of Heru, son of Asar and Aset, and his functioning in creation, that entire story of the virgin birth, immaculate conception, all of that, the death and resurrection of the Savior, and the one who would come to overthrow the rule of Seti, or Setin, or Satan, and so forth. That entire story was taken from the life cycle of the Abosom, the divinity, Heru, son of Asar and Aset. Plugged into that life cycle are certain little stories about healing. And the stories about healing, resurrecting the dead and healing and so forth, comes and casting out demons and all of that, that comes from a different Heru divinity, Kensu Nefer Hetep Heru. If you put Kensu Nefer Hetep Heru side by side with Heru, son of Asar and Aset, and they're both hawk-headed divinities. Sometimes they just simply take the form of a hawk, sometimes the body of a man, the head of a hawk. Side by side, they look identical. The only difference is Heru, son of Asar and Aset, when he wears the crown, it's typically the red and white crown united. Heru, or Kensu Nefer Hetep Heru, he wears the lunar disk as well as the lunar disk, as the crescent moon as well as the full lunar disk as well. That's the only difference, but they look identical. Whites and offspring fuse these two to create the Kensu or Yesu or Yeshua, the fictional cartoon character Jesus. When you talk about the fictional cartoon character Jesus or Yeshua, that includes Yeshua ben Pendera in the Talmud, who was a fictional cartoon character as well. We proved that in our book, The Kukutuntun, The Ancestral Jurisdiction. When you look at Kensu Nefer Hetep Heru, he is the one who casts out demons. He's the one who casts out negative, discarnate, wayward spirits who are causing problems for people, making them ill, making them spiritually ill, making them mentally ill. He casts those discarnate spirits or quote-unquote demons away to purify people. He destroys them and so forth. He wages war against them. And this is why one of the reasons why he is invoked. He also has to do with fertility and so forth. So when you look at him being the great healer, he's a healer, but also a caster out of discarnate spirits, wayward spirits, the so-called demons. This divinity named Kensu, the son of the great hidden divinity, Amen, and the great mother, Mut. So his father is hidden, and he's the son of the great father who is hidden, and his name is Kensu. He has the great mother, and he's a healer, and raises the dead, and you look at the legend of Kensu Nefer Hetep Heru and so forth, him going into the so-called Near East, because they were having an issue with a specific kind of spirit, and it was causing people problems, and they asked the king in ancient Kemet to send his healers up to the so-called Near East Naharin, and they sent the healers there, and the healers were not able to heal the individual, so they sent back, and then Kensu himself directed Kensu Pa'ari Seker, that specific form of Kensu, that divinity, and his shrine to be sent to Naharin to engage that discarnate wayward spirit, that perverse spirit, to heal the individual, and so forth. The shrine of Kensu Nefer Hetep Heru, once the king in the Near East saw the power of that shrine, he kept the shrine there. He didn't want to send it back to ancient Kemet. So as the story goes, and this is on the Bekten Stele, so-called, as the story goes, 3 years passed where he had that shrine of Kensu in his country. And then he had a dream. And what the dream was that Kensu took the form of a golden hawk and flew up out of the shrine and flew back to his temple in ancient Kemet to be with his father. And when the king in the Near East in Naharin awoke from that dream, he realized, I better send this shrine back to ancient Kemet. So he sent the shrine back to ancient Kemet. So this whole notion of Kensu, the divinity Kensu, the child of the great God, the great hidden God, and the great mother, being called out of Egypt. Out of Egypt I will call my son, so to speak. Going into Naharin, or the so-called Near East. and casting out demons and healing and so forth. Then he's kept in the so-called Near East for 3 years. So the Jesus character remains in the so-called Middle East for 3 years, and then his spirit flies up and goes back to be with his father and so forth. That entire story comes directly from King Su Nefer Hetep Heru. So that's part of the filler inside of the Heru Asar Set and Heru story. The entire structure of the story, the skeleton of the story, is the life cycle of the Abosom Heru, son of Asar and Aset. But the filler that the White Snow Offspring used to give context and nuance to the fictional cartoon character divinity in between the Immaculate Conception, virgin birth, 12 years old in the temple, death and resurrection of the Savior, and all of that. The filler is the healing practices and traveling in the so-called Near East for 3 years and a ministry in the Near East for 3 years and engaging in healing and quote-unquote miracles. This is where they stole the filler from. So we did an entire broadcast on that. We showed that Cain Su, as well as Cain Seat, the female divinity, Cain Seat, or Cain Suat in ancient Kemet. Of course, in our Akhan culture, we still have these Abosom, Cain Su, the male Abosom, and Cain Suat, the female Abosom. We still worship them today. And they are minor Abosom. They are children of Inyamewa, Inyame, and so forth. So they talk about this cartoon character, Cain Su, or Yeshua ben Pandera, who never existed. And we prove that in the Kuku Tuntun, the Ancestral Jurisdiction, our book. But they will say, well, he was a sacred therapeutic. What are they really saying? They're talking about Cain Su Nefer Hetep Heru, capacity to function as a healer, as a quote-unquote priest. Well, let's look at one of the titles of a certain kind of priest, as well as a certain kind of priestess in ancient Kemet. And when you look at the image that we use for the show, we spell them out in the Mendutu for the priest as well as the priest. So when you look at that, it's called Kedap, and Kedapu, plural, Kedap, and Kedapi is the female. That's a title. So what does it mean? What does the root word mean? Kedap, to lead, to direct, to superintend, to rule. Also to lay under tribute, to offer, to give, to bring gifts. That's the general term, Kedap and Kedapi. Then you have a director, a governor, or overseer, but then you also have a divine chief, a title of a priest, a title of Tehuti and Heru, a title of the high priest of Ni, and various forms of a title of a priest. And then Kedapi, or Kedapi, is the chief priestess as well. But Kedapi are also the offerings given by the Kedap or the Kedapi. And so you'll find various definitions of Kedapi in ancient Kemet, dealing with one who's a leader, one who is a healer, one who brings offerings, ritual offerings, a title of a priest, a title of a priestess. Kedapi becomes Kedapit, Kedapite, Kedapute, Terapute, Terapate, and everything else. Terapi comes from Kedapi from ancient Kemet. It is a title of a priest, a title of a priestess. So a therapist, one who does therapy, comes from Kedapi, like Kedap from ancient Kemet, a title of a priest to priest. Are these therapists priests and priestesses? Are they invoking the Abosom? Are they evoking the ancestresses and ancestors who are spiritually cultivated, who are connected to your blood circle, who are around you trying to guide you because you have neglected them, or you can't hear them because you're controlled by various conditionings forced on you by the society, or the priestess, when they engage in Adebisa, when they engage in divination, they can communicate directly with the Nsamanfo, the Nananom-Nsamanfo, the spiritually cultivated ancestresses and ancestors of your blood circle who are around you, and they can give you the messages they are trying to give you. They can communicate and invoke the Abosom, the forces in nature that guide you, who are assigned to you, and show you what the Abosom are trying to get you to understand and to recognize that you have been neglected. They can see discarnate, wayward spirits around you and it can engage in ritual practice to repel those entities, repel those discarnate, wayward spirits, whether they're discarnate spirits of relatives or non-relatives, who are causing and projecting all kinds of negative energy upon you, just like if someone alive near you is a very negative person, you can feel the negativity on them whenever you're around. The heavy negative energy or the discordant, crazy type, disjointed energy that emanates from them because they're not a harmonious individual. When they put pressure on you or focus on you and engage you in some fashion, you can feel their negativity emanating from them just by being around. When such an individual dies, physical body, of course, buried, but their spirit body is still disjointed, spiritually discordant. They have discordant energy, negative type, discordant, disjointed kind of energy that you can feel, you can pick up. And when those individuals seek to communicate with you and plant thoughts in your mind and urges and motivations and so forth, if you're part of this culture, you assume that every single thought that enters your mind must be yours. And if you have crazy thoughts, negative thoughts, suicidal thoughts, and so forth, you assume that they are yours. Then you go see a therapist or the rapist who's going to pollute or force pseudo-information, pseudo-cosmology, pseudo-philosophy into your mindset, raping that into your mindset to make you believe you need to operate in a certain fashion. You go see such a therapist or the rapist, and they give you misinformation and sometimes medication that causes negative side effects in you physiologically, whether it's weight gain, whether it's depression, whether it's making you even similar to a catatonic individual, dumbing you down, making you numb to the world and so forth, truncating your perception and so forth, all different kinds of negative effects of this kind of medication, as well as the negative effects it has physiologically on melanin-dominant people, these psychotropic medications designed to destroy our melanin. So you go to such an individual, you receive this kind of medication, you receive pseudo-information. They are not able to deal with the actual issue. If you are having, as we said in the past, having thoughts of suicide all of a sudden, every time you walk across the bridge near your job to go to lunch and you cross the bridge, every time you cross that bridge, you have an overwhelming, heavy sense and desire to jump and kill yourself. So you go to a therapist because it begins to scare you. Why am I, every time I'm crossing the river, I have this heavy negative energy that descends upon me and I feel like I want to jump. And you're going to this therapist, the rapist, and they're trying to probe into your family life and probe into what has happened to you ever since you were a child and abandonment issues and all of this other nonsense, using these foolish therapies that they've learned from the whites and offspring, this therapeutic model they've been given. And in reality, there was an individual who went to that bridge a few years back. They jumped off the bridge and killed themselves. Their spirit is still hanging around that bridge. And every time you walk by, because you're receptive, and most people are not even focused like that because you're a little bit receptive spiritually, you pick up on them. And you pick up on their anxiety, and they're projecting that melancholy. They're projecting that sense of worthlessness and lack of value, and that whole notion of the desire that they had to jump, and they actually did jump. You pick up on all that negativity from them. This is why every time you cross the bridge, you have this overwhelming sense to jump. You're being influenced by the one who did jump, and they're still upset over the fact that they jumped, and they're just earthbound and wayward and depressed and angry. It has nothing to do with you. It only has to do with them. If they were physically alive and sitting on the bridge as a homeless person, and every time you walk by, they yelled out to you, hey, you need to jump. Well, you know that's just a homeless person yelling out at everybody, and you just keep walking because you know what's going on. But if that person's physical body is not there and their spirit is sitting there that you cannot see, but they project that energy, hey, you need to jump, well, then now all of a sudden you think it's your own desire. So you go to a therapist, and they cannot deal with what's really happening. So they'll put you on some behavior modification regimen. They'll put you on some medication because you're having quote-unquote panic attacks or anxiety attacks and so forth, and you're feeling depressed and you're talking to your husband or spouse or whatever. If you're male, talking to your wife, or female, talking to your husband, and so forth, they're putting you on medication to try to calm you down, and you're getting concerned. You're worried about your children because why am I having these thoughts of suicide? Maybe deep down inside I'm not as happy as I really thought I was, and maybe it goes back to my parents. All kinds of idiocy. For years, months or years, going to see therapists and being on medication. If there was a really a terapist or a priestess, a healer or a healeress, they would simply do the divination. They would see that spirit who's sitting on the bridge. They would tell you, hey, that spirit is sitting on the bridge. This is why every time you walk by that bridge, they're just yelling out and you're picking up on them. That's all that's happening. Your anxiety is instantaneously eradicated. 10 minutes, it's gone. No medication, no therapy, none of that nonsense. A pseudo-therapist, a pseudo-psychologist cannot deal with that. If you would like to repel that individual because you don't want to be that receptive and you haven't developed your own sun to the point that your sun has become oduru or heavy and having enough weight to repel that kind of individual, they may direct you to utilize a certain kind of purificatory process, cleansing yourself, or even using a specific Akhuamuman, which in the Akhan culture is called a talisman. Charge that talisman up on your ancestral shrine and wear that, and that individual or entity is repelled, and they're not able to get close to you. The energy is repulsive. It's like two magnets on a table with the same polarities facing. Once the large magnet is placed next to the smaller magnet, its repulsive power pushes that magnet away, and they can't get close anymore. So once you begin to generate that kind of power through spiritual work, as well as infusing that kind of energy through your nsamanfo at your ancestral shrine with the talisman that you wear, the Akhuamuman you wear, if you would like to do that, you can repel that individual, that entity, as well as others. But doing the work at your ancestral shrine and your own spiritual work with your craft, you will generate that kind of centripetal force to repel such wayward spirits, and they won't be able to get close enough to you. You'll generate that firepower. So a therapist can't deal with that. And that's just a basic example of what healers and healeresses, Afurakani, Afuraitkaitnit priests and priestesses have been doing for thousands of years. Real keta and terapist, real priests and priestesses who have that capacity. So let's get into, first of all, we want to get into some information with regard to medicine. Because basically when people have issues, it's either a medical condition or a non-medical condition. Somebody has a traumatic brain injury, a TBI, somebody has, problems with regard to hormonal secretion, chemical imbalances and so forth. Those things can be dealt with medically. And then, of course, you have individuals who don't have any hormonal imbalances, people who do not have a traumatic brain injury, they don't have any, they're not requiring some neuropsychological exam. They're just having problems with regard to behavior because of things that have taken place in their lives, whether it's in the past or in the present, whether it's dealing with certain individuals or groups, whether they're physical or non-physical, ideas and so forth and concepts and the way they relate to those ideas and concepts and the way they've been conditioned. And then they have emotional reactions, and then what follows is the kind of behavior that is prescribed by those emotional reactions, and then they engage in self-destructive behavior, and it becomes a cycle, and they're suffering, and they want to figure out a way to change their behavior and break through that condition. So some people have a physical problem, some people have a non-physical problem. In our Akhan culture, we would say some people have sum yadie, which is spiritual illness, or honam yadie, a physical illness. Sometimes it's a combination of both. Sometimes one informs the other. So with regard to physical illnesses, with regard to a physiological or biological basis for mental illness, we've been dealing with this for thousands of years. The whites and their offspring, if you look at the quote-unquote history of so-called psychology, and of course they're not dealing with the science of the psyche or the quote-unquote soul or spirit, because they have no kra or krawa, soul, divine consciousness, number one. Number two, they don't have a ba or ba'et, a divine living energy, so-called spirit, so they cannot deal with that. They don't know how to deal with that because they don't have that. They don't know about the abosom, the forces in nature that govern those things and how they animate certain aspects of our spiritual anatomy. They can't teach you how to align your spirit, your ba or your ba'et, with the great ba and the great ba'et, who is Ra and Ra'at, the creator and creatress. They can't tell you how to align your kra, your soul, your divine consciousness with the great ka and ka'et, because they can't align with those forces in nature. They cannot communicate with any forces in nature. So they reduce you to their perverse level, their weak level, and make you believe that you have to follow some pseudo-behavioral modification regimen. But first, when you deal with physical, a biological basis for different kinds of behavior, negative behaviors, or maladaptive behaviors, or self-destructive behaviors. The whites and their offspring, what many people don't understand is when you look in the so-called history of psychology, it's only in the so-called 1800s and into the 1900s that they really began to pick up and start trying to engage various forms of behavior modification, operant conditioning, and all of that nonsense, and all these so-called, leaders in these different schools of psychological thought, all these different things, whether it's Skinner and Maslow and all these Rogers and all these other individuals. So 1800s into the 1900s, they start studying the brain, studying different things, coming up with different ideas, trial and error, making mistakes and all this other nonsense. But at the same time, the whites and their offspring are studying Afurakani, Afuraitkaitnit, Ancestral Religion. The white ethnographers are going into Afuraikai in the 1800s and even into the 1700s, but picking up in the so-called 1800s. We call the 12,800s and the 1900s 12,900s. Of course, we don't trace time back to 2,000 years ago when there was no fictional cartoon character named Jesus anyway, so we're in the year 13,015. But the so-called 1800s, 1900s, they're going into Afuraikai, sitting with these healers, traditional healers and healeresses, calling them witch doctors and so forth, but then also documenting, when you read these anthropological studies, the healers and healeresses recognizing and understanding the medicinal use of thousands of plants, as well as minerals, as well as glandular medicine from animals and so forth, thousands and thousands of uses, because we've dealt with these plants and minerals and animals for thousands of years. The whites and their offspring are going and studying these things and observing these things and writing about them in their anthropological journals. Then they come back to America, and they do the same thing when they go into the Amazon and so forth. And then they come back to America, go back to Europe, gather some of these plants, gather some of these minerals and so forth, and try to replicate what they learned when they were observing our people in the forests and so forth, in the villages, the traditional healers and healeresses. Various forms of healing and anesthesia and anti-inflammatories and everything else. The whites and their offspring give different names to these things. We've had names for these things all along. Then they replicate these things. They get plants that are similar to the plants they find on the continent or in the Amazon, or they try to replicate these things in laboratories, produce these medicines in these pharmaceutical companies, and promote them as this is the cure to these different diseases, so this is going to help you with your hormonal secretions that are out of balance and out of whack and so forth. All these different things they're learning directly from observing our people in our traditional culture. Now, once they do that, and they come forward and they begin to write and they begin to publish, they betray the fact that they've been studying our ancient culture. So you find individuals, for example, these so-called pillars of white pseudo-psychology. People know about Sigmund Freud, but he wrote a book, Moses and Monotheism, which was some nonsense, but when you look at his pictures and look at the thing, like the picture of him sitting in front of his desk, and he has these images, these statues of deities from ancient Kemet all over his desk. And he's talking about the religion of ancient Kemet, because when they began in the late quote-unquote 1700s into the 1800s and 1900s, why was psychology beginning to explode in the manner that it was? Number one, they were all over Afuraitkaitnit. Of course, the Berlin Conference took place in 1884 to 85. They carved up the continent and so forth after the end of enslavement, and they began to colonize the continent, and they're going in and observing and writing about the people, trying to find the weaknesses of the people. At the same time, they're collecting information about the culture, trying to see what makes the people tick, including the medicine. Because if you learn about the medicine, you can also learn how to poison the people most effectively. So they're learning about these things and learning about the medicinal use of thousands of plants and so forth. But at the same time, there's an explosion of so-called Egyptology. And the whites and their offspring, whether it's the French or the Germans or the later the Americans and so forth, the British, they're all over ancient Kemet, as well as into Nubia, into Kannat, finding these papyri, like the Ebers medical papyrus and all these other papyri, learning that our people were already dealing with these issues, mental illness, behavioral illness, and so forth, spiritual illness, thousands of years ago, effectively, as well as physical illness, and was dealing with medicines and so forth. So they're finding these different things. Sigmund Freud, the reason he's studying ancient Kemet and even writing a book associating, Akhenaten with, Moses and all this other nonsense, is because they're studying that culture. And they're learning about these ideas, and they're taking fragments from these papyri and things they're learning from traditional healers on the continent, taking these fragments, corrupting these fragments, and creating a field of pseudo-psychology or psychoanalysis, a certain form of therapy, pseudo-therapy, psychotherapy, from what they learned from our people. One of his proteges, Carl Jung, dealing with archetypes and so forth, but Carl Jung, of course, writes the introduction to one of the major English translations of the I Ching Oracle, the Book of Changes. Of course, the I Ching Oracle is a corruption of Oracle going back thousands of years when the Afuraitkaitnit people in the so-called Near East went into Asia and established civilization. We know about the Fuhisi dynasty, divine dynasties in China, the Shang dynasty in China, the founding civilizing dynasty in China. The Book of Changes comes from Afuraitkaitnit people. That oracular divination system comes directly from our people. And of course, people have made associations with the I Ching Oracle, often written I Ching, but the I Ching Oracle, that part of the world that was introduced by our people coming out of Sumer and so forth, made associations with that, with ancient Kemet, as well as the Afa system of the Igbo, Ifa system, the Yoruba, Fa, in Vodun, and so forth. Of course, the palm nuts, the 16 palm nuts utilized in the Ifa oracular divination system are called the I Ching. So, of course, we understand that. So, the whites and their offspring, Carl Jung studying an Afuraitkaitnit divinatory system, an oracular divinatory system. Not understanding it, but just making the point that when they're talking about archetypes and everything else, they're getting these ideas directly from our culture and corrupting them and truncating them and putting them forward as forms of, psychology. You find individuals such as Maslow talking about a hierarchy of needs. You look at the little pyramid and the hierarchy of needs, which is bogus, but they put it forward. All they're doing, replicating, on one hand, the so-called tree of life, but even before that, dealing with the so-called, what we talked about last night, the kara, which is a term from ancient Kemet, talking about the so-called chakra systems. When you look at the 7 chakras and you look at the hierarchy of needs, going from the base to self-actualization and all of that, that is nothing but the kara system, or the so-called chakra system, reworded. That's all it is. So all they're doing, and if you look at more recent diagrams like the so-called awareness wheel and so forth, and you look at the Dharma Chakra in Buddhism, you're finding the same thing. But then before the Dharma Chakra, the wheel of truth and so forth in Buddhism, where they stole the awareness wheel from, as well as in Taoism, you'll find, of course, the Dikenga from the Bakongo tradition. You'll find, you look at the circular zodiac in ancient Kemet and Dendera, you'll find that same structure, that same cosmogrammic structure. So we've already had these things in place. The whites and their offspring are going, studying these things, grabbing information, recasting them as their own discoveries, corrupting them into fragments, and putting forth these corrupted fragments as systems of behavior modification. Even when you look at forms of therapy, client-centered therapy, talking about Roger and all the other nonsense, and the way they operate. They're not creating or putting forward anything new. They're not putting forward any kind of brand new process, any kind of revolutionary process at all. And let me see, before we go forward, I want to make sure if there are any questions in the chat room. If you have a question or comment on the phone line, hit the number 1. If you have a question, or if you would like to comment in the chat room, you have to log in as a user in the chat room in order to comment. If you don't have a username, you can sign up for one very quickly in Blog Talk. I just want to make sure I saw that we had a couple comments in the chat room. I just want to make sure they weren't questions before we move forward. Just scrolling through right quick. Okay, one of the questions, what do you recommend? As far as studying the ancient text, I've tried reading the pertinent roots, start, and some bits from the others, but mostly I don't understand what I'm reading. So in fact, we are going to get to that. That's actually coming up real quick. Just want to scroll through to make sure, and if we don't cover it, then of course you can put forward some more questions, but we are about to get to that whole notion of dealing with some of these texts. So let me just go through right quick again to make sure that we didn't miss anything. Okay. All right. So again, when we're talking about these individuals putting forth these modes of therapy or these philosophical foundation for an approach to psychotherapy and so forth, or just psychology in general, they're not creating anything on their own. In the so-called 1800s and 1900s, two major sources, as we said, going into Afuraitkaitnit, studying with these healers or observing these healers, and healers says anybody who reads anthropological journals, and when they're talking about witch doctors and healers and shamans and everything else, and they're fascinated by the way we are able to utilize all these medicines and understand them and recognize them by memory and communicate with the spirits of the plants and so forth, and gather that information, know what time of the day to pick the plants and the herbs, and what time of night and what time of year, and what incantations to utilize and so forth. All this information they're coming in contact with. That's one source. At the same time, the Egyptological information, Egyptology is beginning to explode and grow. So they're discovering these papyri, discovering these ancient texts and so forth, and then they're taking information from that as well and trying to incorporate that. And then you find that they betray the fact that they're doing that when you look at the actual modes that they're putting forward. So whether it's these major individuals, Freud or Skinner or Maslow or Jung or Roger and so forth, all these individuals getting that information. For example, when you're talking about Roger and the way they deal with therapy, the client-centered therapy, and someone asks a question and you repeat the kind of question back to them and try to change their, perception of what they're asking or what statement they put forward, and you return it to them in the same fashion, that little technique that has nothing, that's not Rogerian, has nothing to do with Roger. That's actually a mode of healing that we use, and it's much more developed. What the whites and offspring would call homeopathy. When you look at the materia medica and homeopathy and so forth, and start rising up, so-called 19th century into the 20th century, and that mode of healing as opposed to allopathic, where you have allopathic healing, you have a toxin within your system, and you want to, overcome the disease and so forth. If you have the toxin in your system, then the allopathic mode is to get something else that's going to contradict that toxin and you put that in your system, and then they fight it out. So, whatever you put into your system, whatever quote-unquote medicine or herb or whatever you use to put into your system to wage war against the toxin, and hopefully what you put in your system can wage war against the toxins, be more powerful. It may hurt your body a little bit in the meantime, but then eventually the quote-unquote medicine beats down the toxin. Hopefully you become cured. That's the allopathic mode. There's a difference. You have the toxin, and then you have something that's contradictory, and then they wage war and fight it out. The homeopathic approach is you have a toxin in your system, and then you take an herb or you take a mineral and so forth that is similar in nature to the toxin, and then you add that and put that in your system as well. So you already have the toxin in your system, then you add something that's very similar to that toxin, and it adds on to the toxin. It's homeo, or the same. Now that forces your immune system to jumpstart itself because more of that toxin has been infused into your system, and that provokes a response. By using something similar to the toxin and adding it to what's already there, it provokes the healing response, the natural healing response, and your immune system will therefore kick up its processes and remove all of the toxins. And through a homeopathic modality, you become healed. You're talking about Roger, and someone gives you a statement in therapy, or gives you an idea or concept in therapy, your client, and then you return that back to them in a similar fashion, but slightly different, to provoke a response so they can see that there are contradictions and so forth. That's a homeopathic process. And when people go to the Nsamanfo, to the Nsamankomere, the ancestral shrine, and you communicate with your Nananom Nsamanfo, as well as communicating with your Nananom Mpanyifo in the world, your honorable elders and elderesses, but the Nananom Nsamanfo, the spiritually cultivated ancestresses and ancestors in general, you will find that they use that modality, that so-called homeopathic modality, as well when they communicate with us. We know that modality. That's nothing new. We didn't have to learn that from some cracker named Roger. You sit with the Nsamanfo and you project what's going on in your life, and you're trying to figure out what's happening, and they project those same things back to you in a similar fashion, and it provokes within you that response, that immune system response, to recognize where the contradictions are. That's the way the Nsamanfo, a major way that they communicate and guide us through that quote-unquote homeopathic process. So we're just saying that to show that these different major quote-unquote individuals, so-called pioneers in Western pseudo-psychology, you will find that all of them were studying something from ancient Kemet, or studying our ancestral culture in some fashion, or gathering information from that, and manufacturing corrupted pseudo-philosophies and putting them forward as new schools of thought or new approaches to behavior modification and so forth. So, but when we're going back to medicine, first of all, we said we dealt with medicine. Not only when the whites in our spring in the so-called 1800s and 1900s were going to study in Afuraitkaitnit and so forth. Prior to that, of course, even in Europe in the 1600s and 1500s and so forth, before all of that jumped off, before they were able to come to Afuraitkaitnit and learn about these different things from our people, before the Egyptology jumped off and they were digging through our tombs and shrines and so forth, the way they got the information is because our people brought it to them. So some of our people who were brainwashed Islam and so forth, and were erroneously referred to by the whites in our spring as Moors. And of course, we have our book, Moor Means Dead, proving that the term Moor means dead, and it's always been a derogatory term. It comes directly from ancient Kemet. It means physically dead, damned, as well as socially dead, meaning slave, vassal, afflicted, wretched, servant, and so forth. And this is why the whites in our spring identified our people as such, because it's a derogatory term, and it's foolish to suggest otherwise. So we prove that in our book. But those who were brainwashed with the pseudo-religion of Islam and in connection with the white criminal Arab went into Southern Europe as quote-unquote Moors and so forth. Yes, they brought some science, some basic science. Yes, they brought some knowledge of pharmacology. They brought some knowledge of biology, and a number of different things. That basic information was enough to transform the minds of white Europeans to recognize that they didn't have any information, didn't have any knowledge, and they needed to gather as much information as they possibly could because they wanted to figure out a way to try to use that technology that they learned to wage war against our people. Basic technology, creating weapons and everything else. They were not, of course, able to use anything spiritual against our people. That's nonsense. They don't have the capacity to communicate with any forces in nature. They don't have the capacity to communicate with any spiritually cultivated ancestresses and ancestors because they have none. So there's no such thing as the whites in our offspring using our spiritual sciences against us. That's nonsense. That only comes from the mouths of individuals who are not really engaged in ancestral culture and religion for real. So, but they just learn basic things, just like if somebody went to a university, went to MIT and learned about technology. Well, the people who were the university professors in Southern Europe, the black people who were foolishly called Moors, they were the university professors. And the whites in our offspring were going to these universities, learning basic things about biology and chemistry and engineering and science and mathematics and everything else. Basic building blocks of a basic society. They learned that from our people as well as we said, medicine. So they were learning those different things. The whites in our offspring typically, during those times before Egyptology jumped off and so forth, they were Christians primarily. All the information was held by the priests, the male priests, the faggots, and so forth. And they were learning things, different things from the so-called Moors. Some of them started trying to deal with what is considered a cult. Again, that has no basis in any real spirituality. When black people who were associated with white Arabs began to deal with the ritual practices and bringing those ritual practices into Southern Europe, they were not bringing ancient ancestral religion or ancient ritual practice into Europe. Once they had embraced Islam, embraced the whites and their offspring and that nonsense, they were cut off from the actual divinity. The forces in nature do not participate in disorder. So the only agency and facility that they have is facility with discarnate, wayward, disordered spirits of their own relatives, deceased relatives, and non-relatives. So they're working with those wayward, homeless, crackhead type spirits. Just like some people would give some money to a crackhead to run something or do something for them while they're alive. Well, when they make their transition, that little homeless spirit, they will hang around and the person will promise to sacrifice an animal to them ritually to release that energy. And that spirit, just like they fed off the energy of a crack rock when they were alive, they will feed off the energy of a freshly killed animal, the release of energy when they make their transition. And if you promise them, I will kill this goat for you, I will kill this bird for you, if you go as a spirit and go listen in on somebody or go do this and go do that, then I will kill this animal for you and feed you, then those crackhead type spirits will do that. These are the kinds of spirits that the blacks who have become known as Moors were working with. That is the basis of the so-called occult in Europe. They weren't dealing with real ancestral religion. They weren't dealing with real divinities because they were already cut off. They were engaged in disorder. They were embracing the whites and their offspring. So they were cut off from real culture, and the only thing they had left was lower-level pseudo, quote-unquote, witchcraft, which is called the occult. The whites and their offspring thought it was the greatest thing they'd ever seen. But, of course, with regard to our culture, it's the lowest level of culture imaginable. So, but they thought it was the real deal. So they learned about medicine, learned about pseudo-ritual practices from these individuals dealing with wayward, criminal, deceased spirits as well, and they were learning information like that and trying to deal with manipulating people's thoughts and behavior patterns, dealing with these spirits and so forth. So whether they learned about that information and called it a cult, or they learned about information, basic information from Moors and universities, or later on, that was prior to the 1700s and 1800s, then later on with the birth of Egyptology, as well as Europeans coming into Afuraitkaitnit and observing traditional healers in their own environments and their understanding, their expansive knowledge of the medicinal use of herbs and plants, thousands of them, and glandular medicines from animals and so forth, as well as ritual practices and invocations and so forth, learning that that exists and that the whites and their offspring had no access to it, but learning that it existed. They would take that kind of information extricate what they could, which was minimal, corrupt what they extricated, and then put that forward as these founding schools of philosophy and psychology. So this is what we're doing. Now, our people, if you go back to, we talked about the two major approaches. On one hand, physiological. What is the physiological basis for certain kinds of behavior? If someone has a physiological issue, then of course it can affect their brain, it can affect their behavior. And then the non-physical aspect. Sum yadiye, spiritual illness, ponam yadiye, physical illness. If you go back to ancient Kemet, dealing with priests and priestesses who were also physicians, the oldest mention of a physician in ancient Kemet is not Imhotep. The oldest mention of a physician who was sometimes said to be a contemporary of Imhotep, but very often you'll see maybe 50 years older prior to Imhotep, is Merit Ptah, a female physician. She's the oldest mentioned physician to this point in the true historical record. Merit Ptah, and she was seen as the chief of the physicians, the overseer of the physicians. So she was the first mentioned physician, period, male or female. And then, of course, she's the oldest mentioned female physician to date, on Earth to date, so far that has been uncovered, that's been shared, rather. Because, of course, the whites and offspring have probably come across other information that they did not want to share, that may be 20,000 years old. So Merit Ptah, living about 4,700 years ago, around the time of the third dynasty, the oldest mentioned physician, and the chief of the physicians, chieftainess of the physicians, meaning she was overseeing it. Then, of course, Imhotep, he was the chief physician. He was also a chief architect engineer for the Ancestral Zoseru or Jaseru, so-called Zoser and so forth, builder, the architect of the so-called step Meru, or the step pyramid and so forth. He was a physician, and contemporary with him was another physician, Hetsi Ra. He was the chief of the physicians as well as the dentist in ancient Kemet. So we were already dealing with medicine thousands of years ago, effectively thousands of years ago. We understood the connection between the brain and the behavior, and damage to the brain, and the effect it had on behavior, and effect it had on not only the way we move physiologically, but on our behavior. We were dealing with not only the biological basis of that, but also the spiritual basis of that. But going back to these physicians, the earliest mentions of a male and a female physician on Earth can be found in ancient Afuraitkaitnit. So the whites and offspring have no claim or no connection to understanding the biological basis of certain kinds of behaviors beyond what they learned about from our people. And then when you look at the spiritual basis of certain mental disorders and spiritual discordance, mental imbalances and so forth, of course the priests and priestesses were dealing with that as well, dealing with spirit possession, Akhan, spirit possession, understanding when a spirit leaves the body and so forth, what takes place when they're making their transition to the ancestral realm. If they do not get to the ancestral realm and they're just earthbound and hanging around and causing all kinds of problems, our people understand that most of the problems that people have, most of the negative experiences people have mentally and spiritually and so forth, is the result of these discarnate, wayward spirits who are earthbound, who did not make a smooth transition to the ancestral realm, so they're still hanging around the place that they died, hanging around the place that they were murdered or shot or something like that, hanging around other individuals in the family because they did not move to the ancestral realm. If they were depressed when they were alive, they're still depressed, discarnate spirit. And that heavy, magnetic, heavy energy, you can feel that from that spirit. It affects the person. If the person doesn't understand, they assume that they are feeling melancholy, they are feeling anxious, they are feeling depressed. Or if it's somebody who's very explosive and uncontrolled and fired up and self-destructive and so forth, because they had that kind of energy when they were alive and that led to them being killed and so forth, they still have that same discordant, wayward, explosive, negatively expansive energy and people can pick up on that. And if you're receptive and you don't understand what's going on, because you're living in this culture and you've never been taught to communicate with your Nstamampo on a regular basis, and never been taught to communicate with your crowd, your soul, your divine consciousness on a regular basis, then you'll assume that every thought that enters into your sphere of awareness is directly coming from you, which it is not. When you're involved in culture, when you have an unusual thought, you know instantaneously, well, this is not my thought. It must be somebody else. No different than if you were in a room and you heard somebody a few feet away talking crazy, saying, hey, I need to kill myself. Hey, I want to kill myself. Hey, I want to kill myself. You know, and you can look to the side and see, well, that's somebody a few feet away talking crazy. So you do not incorporate that as part of your own thought process. You know it's somebody else. But if that person was deceased and they don't have a physical body and they're projecting those kinds of thoughts and intentions, and you don't see anybody, if you're raised in this culture and you have these unusual thoughts and you start hearing, I want to kill myself, I want to kill myself, I want to kill myself, you automatically assume, why am I feeling like I want to kill myself? But people who actually practice ancestral culture, instantaneously, we know right away if crazy thoughts are arising, we know automatically that has nothing to do with us. Who is this around us? And what do we need to do to repel them? Number one. And number two, what happened to put us in the position where our kahaibit, or our aura, became so porous that we were able to allow one of these wayward kind of spirits to attach themselves to us? How come we didn't repel them? What happened to our spiritual immunity? It's just like your physical immunity. When your physical immunity is sound, you walk down the street, there are germs entering into your system, you go to work, people are coughing and they have the flu and everything else, and you repel all of that and you have no problem without effort. But if your physical immunity is compromised because you're not getting enough sleep, you're not eating properly, you're not exercising and so forth, then you get overcome with the same bacteria that normally would bounce off of you. You get assaulted by it and it takes you down for a few days or a week or more. If you compromise your spiritual immunity, then those discarnate projections from discarnate spirits that normally would bounce off of you and you would repel them, your aura becomes porous and now they can get in and affect you. So first you want to figure out a way to repel them, to get them away from you. And secondly, how to repair your aura, how to restore your spiritual immunity. Just like you restore your physical immunity through exercise, through sleep, through taking in medicines, natural, as well as eating different foods that you need to restore your physical immunity. In the same fashion, we have ritual practices to restore our spiritual immunity, to not only repel these negative entities, and our Nstamampo ancestresses and ancestors will assist us in that repulsion, but also how to maintain and strengthen and fortify our spiritual immunity so they wouldn't be able to get that close in the first place. So, all right, so before we go forward, I just want to check out, see, we have a call on the phone line. Okay, Michiawo on the phone line, number 5096. You had a question or comment?
Yes, Michiamo. This is, I like to say, God say this is filling good information. I want to stress about the psychiatrists in the 18th century. I was reading something about Mongoloid. How do you say that? Mongoloid.
Right.
Mongoloid people, and they were associating the Mongoloid people, calling us Negroid, and they were saying that there was like a mental deficiency of Down syndrome. And what I want to ask you is, I didn't know if that we were associated with Mongoloid people, or are we?
So, and of course, there's a lot of, misinformation floating around out there. But, of course, our people are the first people, of course, on Earth. When we began to migrate outside of Afuraitkaitnit, and for individuals who are new to the information, when we talk about Afuraitkaitnit, that's the origin of the term Africa. We published a book, proving that conclusively. We migrated out of Afuraitkaitnit tens of thousands of years ago, before any other race existed anywhere in the world, before a small percentage of our people, degenerated in northern Eurasia into the whites and our offspring. But we migrated out into southern Europe, into the so-called Near East, so-called Middle East, into southern Asia, also into Australia. So when you see, for example, the Andamanese people of the Andaman Island, just south of the Indian subcontinent, you'll see that they're jet black, full noses, full lips and everything, and they have the same natural hair that we have on the continent. They don't have straight hair, they have natural hair. This whole notion of straight hair being part of one race of Ethiopians has straight hair, and the other race of Ethiopians has naturally curled hair, that's inaccurate. That only came through miscegenation. And people have done the Idar locust studies showing when Southeast Asians first began to develop this, straightened out hair as a result of miscegenation from the whites and offspring. Prior to that, the same people you see in the Andaman Islands, the same exact kind of hair and facial features that you see anywhere in Nigeria, Ghana, or anywhere else, these are the same people. So when you look at the Khoi people and the San people, so-called Bushmen and so forth, light brown people, their eyes are quote-unquote slanted. Some people say, well, they have the same features as the Asians, the Chinese. No, the Asians have their features because they are the people who migrated into Asia. Only thing that happened is some of our people migrating into certain areas and, of course, also getting corrupted and mixed with the whites and their offspring begin to lose their pigmentation. But foundational population, of course, is our people. So this is where they come from. And we did a broadcast on race and identity, talking about the origins of the whites and their offspring, our people migrating into Eurasia, a small percentage of our people being drawn up into northern Eurasia because of their discordant behavior. They repel their own Krawa, soul, divine consciousness, and that precipitates their spiritual disfigurement and degeneration. And that later leads to a physical degeneration, which is the loss of melanin, abatum, and so forth, and morphological characteristics being corrupted and so forth and all of that. So we did a broadcast on that, but the original inhabitants of Asia with those kinds of features and so forth were our people, and then the mixture of the Europeans creates this Asian, quote-unquote, entity that we see today.
So you are agreeing with the monogoid being a mental disorder of Down syndrome that is part of that, what happened with mingling with them, the other people. So are you saying
you'll find that like in some NKWAMUA nonsense and some other texts that they got that from, because they were looking at the way people, the morphological structure of people with Down syndrome, the way their eyes look and so forth. It looked kind of similar to the way the eyes of Asians look. So from that, they extrapolated that, hey, this is, Mongoloidism comes directly from Down syndrome, and they created a whole philosophy behind it. But in reality, that's nonsense. In reality, the slanted, quote-unquote, eyes and the structure of the cheekbone, the phenotype, when you look at people in, the Kalahari Desert, for example, and even because the Kalahari Desert at certain times of the year can become very cold, even freezing temperatures in certain areas, but it's in, of course, Afuraitkaitnit. You'll see that the San, quote-unquote, Bushmen and some of the Khoi and so forth, before they, intermix with the Bantu people, those who have not, they'll be a little bit lighter brown. They'll be light brown to even yellowish, sort of, tannish, as opposed to totally jet black. So you'll see those individuals with that facial structure, those higher cheekbones, the more slanted eyes and so forth, and those are the ones who went into Asia. So this is where those morphological characteristics come from.
Yes, because I don't believe the 18th century, 19th century psychiatrists, they pretty much made up what they wanted to say about us anyway, right? So I kind of questioned, and I thought I asked you. So, all right, and then the Marie Ptah, that's the first time I heard that, and thank you, my doctor, for that. Marie Ptah, how do you spell the Marie? Is it M-E-R-I with the T again, or?
Yes, exactly. Marie Ptah. So you Google Marie Ptah, you'll find some information on her.
And I just wanted to say that during my journey coming along, from Hebrew, studying that and the Moors, I used to feel that kind of leeriness about the Moors, and so I felt that General Balsam directed me to your teachings, and I'm so grateful for that. Just want to say that. And without say thank you.
Okay, and I say that. And may I say again, we appreciate the call and appreciate the support. And so Meri Ptah, of course, Meri means beloved, so Meri Ptah means beloved of Ptah. Of course, you'll find, so the most ancient description dealing with the evidence of a physician is this female, Meri Ptah, beloved of Ptah. Then you'll find, of course, that Imhotep later on becomes a deified ancestral spirit, and he becomes the child of Ptah, Setchima, Sekhmet. So you'll find the triad is Ptah, Setchima, Sekhmet instead of Tem or Nefertem, Ptah, Sekhmet, and Imhotep, the son of Ptah, and so forth. So just like he is beloved of Ptah, so is the physician Meri Ptah, beloved of Ptah. That's important because Ptah or Ptah, he becomes Oboadier in Akhan, Oboadier. He is Sakpata in Vodun. He is Obaluaye in the Yoruba tradition. Of course, this is the divinity that deals with epidemics as a great healer. And then you have Sekhmet. She also deals with epidemics, but she is a great healeress. Also to the point that her priests and priestesses were called Sunu. Sunu means physician. So the priests and priestesses of Setchima Sekhmet are also Sunu, meaning doctors or physicians. So the first evidence of a doctor or physician, the female is Meri Ptah or beloved of Ptah, and so is Imhotep. He's Sa Ptah, son of Ptah, and he's also Meri Ptah, beloved of Ptah as well, beloved of Oboade, beloved of Sakpata, beloved of Obaluaye, and so forth. Okay. So just want to scroll through right quick. Excuse me. Want to make sure we didn't miss anything in the chat. Bring some more detailed information with regard to the physical aspect, the Honam Yadie, physical illness, and how we deal with that. Of course, we went back to Meri Ptah and Imhotep and so forth, the Ibris medical papyrus. So we were dealing with all of this information with regard to the biological basis for certain behaviors as well as just physical illnesses in general. Then you'll find in the text of ancient Kemet, ritually, you'll have the physical aspect dealt with, but you also have the spiritual aspect dealt with at the same time. If you look, for example, in the Runu Imheru, you'll find the chapter of giving breath to a man in the ancestral realm. And it's an invocation to the Abosom to give breath to a man in the ancestral realm. Two things that you want to look at with regard to that. That is an invocation. It's a ritual prayer. It's not just for somebody to make when they make their transition. It is part of that. That prayer is read as well. And the reason it's read for the individual is because the individual engaged that process while they were on earth. And the breath is coming from the divinity that gives breath. Of course, Atem gives the cool winds when the sun sets. When Atem sets in the setting sun, you see Atem sitting in the red setting sun, in the boat of the setting sun and so forth. And when the sun sets, Atem sends the cool northern winds to enliven the individual and so forth. We feel that when the sun sets, the cool northern winds, we connect with the energy of Atem through the wind that he sends. So the wind becomes a vessel or a carrier of the energy of Atem. And we utilize that to enliven ourselves, invigorate ourselves, and so forth. So we do that on earth, and we invoke Atem for that reason. So the sun itself is a vessel, just like your physical body is a vessel, and your spirit animates your physical body. The sun, the Aten, is a vessel, and there are forces in nature that animate the sun. And just like when you communicate with a dog, you're not communicating with the physical body of the dog, you're communicating with the spirit that animates the physical body of the dog. When we communicate with the Abosom and pray to the Abosom, we're not communicating with the physical body of the sun, we're connecting our energy, our Ba, our divine living energy, with the Ba of the divinity that animates, whether it's the sun or moon or earth mother or oceans, rivers, thunder, lightning, and so forth. So we can communicate directly with them. When he sends that cool wind, it invigorates us, but the energy within the wind invigorates our energy complex as well. So we did that while we were on earth. When the person makes their transition, they want to do that same invocation because they did it while they were on earth. So when you read that prayer and say it in an incantation in that fashion, you're generating and stimulating the energy of that person because they engage that same ritual practice as well. And they begin to align so that they can, the chapter of giving breath or nefi to a man when he makes his transition, so that he can get that breath, that invigoration, that energy from the Abosom, so he can make a smooth transition to the ancestral realm. So once his spirit leaves his body, after he spends a certain amount of time around his surviving relative, in the Akhan tradition, about 40 days, then he begins to make his transition, or she begins to make her transition to the ancestral realm to live amongst the other ancestresses and ancestors. If they don't make that smooth transition, then they get caught up and they're hanging around earthbound. If they were gunned down at a stop sign, then their spirit is hanging around that stop sign. If they committed suicide and jumped off a bridge, their spirit is still hanging around that bridge 10, 15, 20, 50 years later, 100 years later. And they're still going through the same anxiety because they have not elevated themselves and tried to align with order. They're still feeling sorry for themselves, trapped in that cycle of anxiety and depression and melancholy and catatonic characteristics and so forth. But we want to invoke the Abosom to be energized and invigorated, to get full of that invigorating energy of the nest, the divine breath, so that we can move forward and be animated and move forward. So when they utilize that chapter, we did it while we were on earth. So you read that chapter and do that incantation for the person, and it stimulates them and reminds them, okay, I got to get on track. And it helps them to align their energy as well, and they become invigorated. And then they move forward to the ancestral realm. So that's one application, the spiritual application, giving the breath or the nest to a man in the spirit realm. So that helps propel him to get to the realm of the ancestresses and ancestors and make that transition so he doesn't get caught earthbound. Physiologically, and here's the connection between Sunsum Yadie, spiritual illness, Honam Yadie, physical illness, and how it's dealt with. Spiritually, that's dealt with, and now the spirit is settled and harmonious and balanced and so forth. It's not a discordant spirit that's going to hang around and cause people problems. Physiologically, in the world, we can utilize that chapter as well. So if somebody has asthma, we can use that invocation to give breath to the man or the woman in the spirit realm to invigorate them, to help stimulate the invigorating energy that's coming from Akan, to stimulate the energy within their lungs to begin to help heal that asthmatic condition. So that is a ritual process, a ritual invocation. So it's a direct connection, and we've done that, as a matter of fact. And we've had a sister, as a matter of fact, who had a child who was suffering with asthma. That was one of the invocations that she used to help overcome that process, and it was effective. When you look all throughout the Ru, Nu, Pert, and Heru, for example, you'll find these different ritual prayers, and then at the end of the prayer, it says if this prayer is said at a certain time in a certain fashion, this individual will take on this breath, and this a million times true, this person will move into the ancestral realm, live in harmony, and this and that, and show you all the different things that will take place if the individual engages this ritual process. It is not simply for after death. It only works, quote unquote, after death because we were utilizing these same ritual practices in life. Just like when they show the individual giving offerings to the Abosom, engaging in ritual provocation to the Abosom after death, that's because they were engaging in those same ritual provocations in life. So there's a connection between what happens physically on earth and what happens to our spirit. You'll find that all throughout the various texts of ancient Kemet. Another example is what people call sleep paralysis. Sometimes people are having a physiological condition, dietary as well as something emotional. But sometimes, for example, in the Hoodoo tradition, they will talk about a quote-unquote witch riding you. So you're asleep, a discarnate spirit alights upon you, comes down upon you, like sitting on your chest. You can't move your arms, you can't move your legs, you can't open your mouth. You may try to yell out and so forth, and you can't make a sound, you can't move, you can't open your eyes, you can't open your mouth, and this spirit is controlling you. But then when you focus on the Nsamanfo and focus on one of those invocations, immediately you can repel that spirit. So there's two applications for that, and we talked about that before. Number one, in the physical world, when you invoke the Yabosom, spiritually, you repel that spirit, and then you can open your eyes, and then you can open your mouth, and then you can move your arms and move your legs and so forth, and you can operate normally once again. And then when people engage in divinatory practice, somebody who's a real diviner, they can see what spirit that was in your house. They can describe what they look like, who they were, if it was your aunt or your deceased grandmother or some other discarnate spirit who used to live in the house. We had an individual who moved into an apartment, and she's receptive, we mentioned before, and she started seeing this image of this young male, the spirit of a young male in a jogging suit and so forth in the house. And she had a problem with that. She was trying to figure out what's going on. She did some ritual work to kind of repel that energy, but she wanted to figure out why she's seeing this young male in this apartment. And then she found out later by other people who inhabited the building that it was a young male who used to wear jogging suits all the time. He got murdered in that building and lived in that apartment. And this is why, of course, she was saying them. She didn't tell them why she was asking about who used to live in the apartment, because they're not involved in ancestral culture. She was just trying to find out for herself. So she just asked some questions, and people started breaking down who it was who lived in the apartment and who got killed and what he used to wear and what he looked like. So this is what we're dealing with. So when you have a real diviner, they can see these discarnate entities. They can tell you what's going on and what you need to do to repel it. So on a practical level, when certain people have sleep paralysis, sometimes it's a discarnate ancestral spirit or a non-relative discarnate who's trying to control the individual. Once you utilize these invocations, they immediately are repelled because they can't deal with that kind of energy connected to the Abosa. When you look in the text of ancient Kemet, that is laid out in the text of ancient Kemet. You utilize those same invocations when you make your transition, because your body is in the ground, of course, your spirit has emerged. There are certain discarnate wayward spirits who are earthbound who would try to trap you and keep you held earthbound as well and not allow you to get to the ancestral realm. They would try to control you and so forth, but when you engage the ritual practice, what they call in ancient Kemet the opening of the mouth and eyes, then you can repel those negative entities and you can move forward to the ancestral realm in peace and balance and live amongst your ancestresses and ancestors who have gone before you. So the opening of the mouth and eyes happens after death, but it also happens in life with the same kinds of entities. The ones who would try to control you here are also the ones who would try to control you there. If you went to a psychologist or a therapist or the-rapist, they would try to tell you where you're having problems with your mother, and when you were a child you had abandonment issues and you're just struggling and all this other nonsense, and they'll put you on some medication and everything else. Oh, and a diviner, Kerapit and so forth, they can show you ritually how to repel that entity. Number two, how to keep those kinds of entities out simply through ritual practice. 15 minutes knocked right out. None of this going to a therapist every week for 5 or 6 years and spending all kinds of money and getting doped up. That's nonsense. So the opening of the mouth and eyes, when it talks about may my eyes be open my eyes, open my mouth so that I can have movement in my arms and legs and I can repel my enemies and move forward in peace in the ancestral realm. That's exactly what's happening when you engage that invocatory process, repel those negative entities during quote-unquote sleep paralysis. you can now open your eyes, open your mouth, move your arms, move your legs, and operate in harmony once again. So these things are laid out in these texts. Spiritual illness, spiritual discordance, physical illness, physical discordance, or, hindrance and so forth can be overcome ritually. This is part of our culture. And we also want to mention, also with regard to the physical aspect, for example, individuals who we had a client once when we were involved in the field of mental health and so forth, kind of client who really did have a traumatic brain injury, more than one. And this was the basis of the erratic behavior. Individuals trying to set himself on fire on more than one occasion and all kinds of other things. Of course, they placed him on medication. They diagnosed him with an Axis 1 diagnosis, placed him on medication, sent him to a psychiatric hospital on more than one occasion and so forth. He was still flipping out and doing different things. But then we suggested connecting with the naturopathic physician who deals specifically in these areas. So you have certain individuals who are naturopathic physicians, as well as people who are traditional healers or healeresses. But even if you don't have a traditional healer or healeress or somebody who's connected like that in your community, you may have somebody in your area not too far from you who is an Afurakani or Afuraitkaitnit or African and Black naturopath, but they're also interested and focused on ancestral culture, so they approach naturopathy from an ancestral cultural perspective, even if they're not too deeply involved, but at least they have that perspective. And they focus on dealing with mental health issues, and instead of using the pharmaceutical medication, the psychotropics that are typically prescribed, they can help the person move away from those and begin to use a naturopathic approach. And this is what happened with this particular individual, and it changed his entire orientation. He was able to get off of the psychotropic and utilize the modality of a naturopath. So you can look, there are many different naturopaths all across the country. Our people and some of our people focus on, specifically, that's their niche. They're focused on dealing with mental health issues and helping individuals get off of psychotropic and utilize naturopathic modalities to achieve the same result, but even a better result, because you're not destroying your melanin, not destroying your body and so forth. And if they're really focused, then they can help realign the person's mindset and help them engage in ritual practice so they can get, in harmony fully. But this was an individual who really did have a physiological issue, traumatic brain injury on more than one occasion. And that was, they were able to deal with that. And of course, traditional healers and healeresses are people who understand medicine, communicate with the spirits of the plant, minerals and so forth, extract that medicine and utilize it to heal. When you look, for example, at George Washington Carver, who revolutionized agriculture in the United States and, of course, the world, created hundreds of products from sweet potatoes and peanuts and so forth. He was an individual who said he got all of his knowledge from going out into nature every morning, early in the morning, communicating with the spirits of nature, taking the information they gave to him and replicating that in the laboratory and producing these various innovations and so forth that transformed agriculture in the world. At the same time, and he was not initiated, he didn't go to the continent and spend thousands of dollars to get some bogus initiation from somebody who's just trying to rob him from some money and give him a title. He was born into the world with the connection to the abosom, like all Afurakani, Afuraitkaitnit people are. He instinctively utilized his connection to do so, to extract that kind of information. Connected with the NKWAMUA. Many of you are connected with your ancestors and ancestors. You feel them, you see them ever since you were a child. So you need to utilize that connection because they were assigned to you for a specific reason. They're from your clan. They're assigned to you and designed to guide you throughout the course of your life, just like the abosom who are connected to your blood circle, who you came into the world with, are assigned to you by the Supreme Being so that you can execute your function in creation. So, just like he did that with regard to transforming agriculture and creating hundreds of products out of sweet potatoes and peanuts and so forth, in the same fashion, we have people, some of you as well, who can go into the forest as well, communicate with the spirit, plant life, mineral life, and so forth, as well, and extract what you need to heal yourself and heal people in our community. It's not based on some pseudo-initiation. It's based on what you were encoded with pre-incarnation by the Supreme Being that you are to carry out here. That is your function, to execute in creation. You're abdicating your role if you do not execute that function. So it's not dependent on anyone else but the abosom that came into the world with you, and the nananom nsamafo, the spiritually cultivated ancestresses and ancestors who were assigned and are assigned to you. So you have that connection to you. And just like he learned about that with regard to agriculture, we can utilize that same connection to extract medicine. We can utilize that same connection to extract what we need to extract for chemical and biological warfare to wipe out our enemies. We have a precedent that was established by our ancestresses and ancestors in North America for that purpose. When we waged war against the whites in our spring during enslavement, going in for us getting the plant life and mineral life we needed, making the proper concoction to poison the food supply, poison the water supply of the whites in our spring on the plantations to either make them sick or die, and then we would kill them, burn down the plantations, and free ourselves. We have established that precedent during enslavement and prior to that. And we have the capacity to do the same thing, be motivated by the ancestresses and ancestors in our bosom to find out what specific viral agent that can destroy the whites in our offspring and not have any ill effect upon us at all. That is within our grasp. Once we make that connection and are motivated by our own abosom, forces in nature that govern us, that were born into the world with us, and the nananom nsamako, the spiritually cultivated ancestors and ancestors to us, assigned to us. So, I want to check out a couple of things here. We did want to get into very quickly our AFURA whole life interventions therapeutic model. We did an entire broadcast on that, so we don't have to go into too much detail. And we also did a broadcast on our Newt cosmogram, which is the AFURA whole life interventions therapeutic models based on that cosmogram as well. And we talked about the unfolding of behavior through a cyclical fashion. So we can go to that quickly. And first, we're going to take a couple of calls. I'm going to go to that. One thing I do want to say, it is 10:53. There are 7 minutes left in the broadcast as far as online. If you want to listen beyond 11 o'clock, you must call in before 11 o'clock so you can get on the phone line. Everybody on the phone line will be able to hear beyond 11 o'clock. If you are not on the phone line by 11 o'clock and you're just listening online, then you will be cut off because it cuts off at 11 o'clock. The phone line, the number for the phone line, 657-383-0635. 657-383-0635. And you have like 6 minutes to call in. But for those who can't stay on, let me just do this. We're going to go through the information with regard to our cosmogram and the unfolding of behavior, just to summarize that, to show there's an approach to therapy, so-called therapy. There's an approach where we incorporate and help the individual discover self-discovery, their connection to their own abosom, connection to their nsamafo, but their possibly inherited ancestral values so they can discover those, self-discovery, utilize them, and adapt them to various situations. A basic therapeutic model to incorporate knowledge of culture so we can address the whole life of the individual. This is why we have an AFURA whole life intervention therapeutic model to incorporate this kind of information. If you are not dealing with the physical and spiritual aspects of the person, then you're not dealing with the whole. All you're doing is, instead of being a therapist, you're a the-rapist, and you're just forcing misinformation into the individual and sometimes drugs into the individual so that you can continue to see them. They're not really progressing and so forth. They're just coming to you for therapy and coming to you for advice, guidance, counseling, and so forth, and you're really not assisting that individual and guiding them in a position where they can elevate, they can overcome their obstacles, they can overcome negative conditioning, as well as overcome discarnate entities who have been plaguing them, not only sometimes in this lifetime, but also transcarnation. We have our piece, Amani Hunu, overcoming transcarnational suffering. And we have Akumatra, dealing with transcarnational or trauma recovery alignment. Sometimes people make their transition, they were suffering, like the person who was committed suicide and so forth. They've gone through a number of things when they made their transition, and it stays with them. They're just as depressed and so forth after they made their transition as they were when they made their transition. And they don't do anything to bring themselves into any form of balance. And then eventually, generations and generations later, they reincarnate and come into a situation and born through one of their descendants. They never healed that wound, and the wound is still open. No different than if you get cut. If you don't allow yourself to heal, if you don't do something to make sure that wound is covered up, protected from any further infection from the outside so it can heal and close up and so forth, it can get further infected if it's still open. So if somebody reincarnates through Bebra, reincarnation comes back into the world, the wound is still open. They're still receptive, meaning they're open. Their aura is porous, it's still wide open. Wayward spirits, negative individuals and entities are drawn to them and can leech onto them because that wound was never closed. So then they're the kind of individuals who draw negative entities to them, negative individuals to them, even sometimes negative experiences. They're drawn to a specific wound that's at that kind of lower vibration, or come through one of their descendants who's a male. Their spirit was connected with him all of his life, and that male connects with a woman. It is their spirit who was connected, they're an ancestor or an ancestress of that male. When he connects with whatever woman he connects with, their spirit is drawn into the womb, and then they come into the world. They're drawn to one of their descendants who may not have been spiritually cultivated either, not really focused on that, and they're drawn and born into a situation where there's not a great deal of spiritual protection because of what they've done in the previous lifetime, and they were wounded and they were drawn into the kind of womb and the kind of parentage who are on that same kind of level, and they grew up vulnerable, and they're still open. They draw negative individuals and entities to them and so forth. And then they suffer, and they're like, ever since they were a child, they were always suffering. What's been going on with these individuals? So we deal with overcoming transcarnational suffering. We deal with that in our Aakhuamuman. We did a broadcast on that. We have a method for that. So what we want to do is we're going to deal with this overview, this therapeutic model, this cosmogram, quick, and then we're going to go to the phones, and then we're going to get on the chat room and check out the information. And again, 60 seconds for those who would like to get on the phone line, 657-383-0635, 657-383-0635. You have less than a minute to get on the phone line. If you're only online, you will not be able to hear beyond 11 o'clock. All right. So we just want to deal with the behavioral cycle real quick. And we did a broadcast on this. It's called Apo and the behavioral cycle, so you can listen to that broadcast. We went into some detail after that. So we're not going to go through all of it. Portion is one of the few things that we have not yet released. It's a publication we've done. We're going to release it. But after our whole life interventions, that has been released, and we're going to check that out. So what we say, and the name of that publication is the Ptah Newt. We say after a seed is planted or embedded in the earth, the seed germinates, and the roots reach downward. There's a commingling of the seed's roots with the nutrients and water in the soil. The next major stage of development is the upward push above the surface of the soil. The new sprouts show themselves to the world and to the sun. The next major stage of development is the full flowering of the plant and the maturation of its fruit. The next stage is the harvesting of the fruit, or the detachment of the fruit and the leaves of the plant. As the fruit and the plant's leaves return to earth, new seeds eventually embed themselves within earth, and the life cycle repeats itself. We go through that same cycle. So if we look through, and we're going to flip through this quickly, just to show this is the cosmogram that we use, similar to the Dikenga that you find amongst the Bakongo, but then the Akan people have a similar piece when you look at the symbol for the Sunsum, as well as the Okra-Komwadie, the symbol for the Kra, similar motif and so forth. That circular symbol talking about the 4 positions of the sun and so forth. So first, when a seed is embedded, we talk about seeding or embedding. That's a physical, spiritual perception. A seed is embedded in the ground. That's contact. So when we come in contact with an entity or engage an issue or hear a dilemma, witness an act or an event, etc., this is contact engagement. Hearing, witnessing is akin to the planting or embedding of a seed into earth. The unfolding of our behavior begins with our perceiving the entity, the deed, the issue, the event through our sensory organs. Our sensory organs have physical and spiritual manifestations, and we talk about the 7 spiritual senses, and not just 5. Taste, touch, smell, sight, hearing, balance, and time. And balance and time are the 6th and 7th sense. There are physical aspects and spiritual manifestations through these 7 senses. You can see, of course, physically, you can see beyond the physical, that's clairvoyant. You can hear physically, you can hear beyond the physical, hear ancestral spirits and others, that's clairaudience. You can also smell and taste and touch beyond the physical, clairalience, clairgustance, clairsentience, and so forth. You have a sense of balance. If you didn't have a sense of balance, you would fall over. You wouldn't be able to sit up straight. You wouldn't be able to stand on one leg. Your sense of balance will be off. But you also have a spiritual sense of balance connected to Ma'al, the male divinity Ma'al, and the female divinity Ma'at. Then you also have a sense of time, which includes spatial consideration. So those are the 7 senses. So we perceive, receive, and perceive through our physical and spiritual senses. This perception and reception into our awareness. When we make contact with an individual, an event, and so forth, we receive and we perceive through the physical and spiritual senses. That perception and reception into our awareness is akin to the reception of a seed into earth. Through our perception, the seed or the issue has been planted or embedded. So you contact someone, an event, individual, entity, the perception is like gets into your awareness physically and spiritually. That's a seed being planted or embedded, or an issue being planted or embedded. The next stage is germination or rooting. Once the seed or the issue is embedded into our awareness, our senses are stimulated. The seed or the issue is a matrix of energy which germinates, developing roots which delve below the surface of our external awareness, deep into the roots of our consciousness, and connect with the root energy of our being, which is Nun and Nunet, igniting thoughts and intentions about the entity, deed, event, or issue. Deep within our consciousness, we access the actual value, the truth of the entity, object, deed, or issue. We can also go shallow to a shallow depth and retrieve the embedded conditionings or new conditionings related to the entity, deed, event, or issue. These conditionings may be accurate inside the circle, or they may be inaccurate outside the circle based on how we have been influenced, programmed, and or how we have programmed ourselves. Whether we access the value, the truth, of the presenting issue, or ascribe an inaccurate value to the presenting issue, this is the germination of thought and intentions, consciousness and energy, related to the presenting issue. Our thoughts and intentions regarding the issue have germinated and taken root. So you come in contact with somebody or an individual or an entity or an event, that contact, and you perceive that event or that individual or entity, that perception, it gets into your awareness, the seed has been planted. Now once the seed is implanted, it begins to germinate. It's like a seed going into the ground, it begins to germinate. And the germination occurs and it starts sending its roots down deep within the soil. So once you perceive something, the next piece is you begin to germinate thought. What are your thoughts about what you perceive? This event, this individual, this entity, and so forth. Are you going to go down deep and send the roots down deep and find the actual value of this individual or entity and how they relate to you or should not relate to you. They're a cracker, they're not related to you. Are you finding the value of this individual, entity, event, dilemma, whatever it is, issue? Are you digging down deep to germinate proper thought based on reality? Or are you going to a shallow depth and coming up with foolish ideas about who this entity is or what this event is about or what this issue is about and how you have been conditioned to embrace this certain thing? So you're generating thought, you're germinating thought, whether they're proper and based on reality, because you've germinated deep roots, touching the essence of your being, or you're going to a shallow depth and you're coming up with foolish rationalizations that have been programmed into you or you have programmed into yourself based on your interaction with other individuals. So those thoughts germinate and it stimulates your energy. The next step is sprouting. After germination is sprouting. The first thing that happens once rooted in these thoughts and intentions, the next stage is the unfolding of our behavior. In the unfolding of our behavior is the emergence of energetic responses, reflecting the value associated with the thought. So you germinated certain thoughts about what you perceive, and now you have an energetic reaction to it, an emotional response. And the energetic reaction or the emotional response is rooted in the value that's associated with this entity or the false value that you have ascribed to this entity. So your energetic response is either based on truth, reality, or it's based on foolishness. Energetic responses, you may manifest anger, hurt, joy, exhilaration, fear, relief, attraction, repulsion, etc. The seed has sprouted. What was below the surface of earth, underground, has emerged above the surface. The thoughts that were hidden in the internal recesses of our consciousness have now been forced or sprouted outward. That's an emotional reaction. So the emotional reaction is the first manifestation of the hidden thought. That's the first thing that sprouts or breaks through the surface that people see. You may have a thought that is germinated about a certain individual or entity, but people don't know what you're thinking unless they're spiritually receptive, but they don't know what you're thinking until you manifest first an emotional reaction. That's the sprouting. Then the next stage is the full flowering of the plant. After it sprouts, it begins to flower or mature. And these are the actions. The next stage in the unfolding of our behavior is the manifestation of intention, our actions. Your actions are the manifestation of your intention. Our actions are rooted in the value we have ascribed to or properly recognized within the presenting issue and are powered by the energetic responses, emotional output associated with said value. The recognized or the ascribed values that were hidden in the root energy of our being as intentions have now fully flowered and matured. What was initially hidden in the seed has now borne fruit. The action, our behavior, which is the fruit, are the manifestation of our intention. Now, of course, we must also note that there are times that we intend to act, yet are hindered from doing so. While we may visualize and or contemplate action, the action is never carried out. However, the visualization or contemplation of action sets energy in motion and has a measurable effect upon our awareness, our physiology, and our future behavior, including the next stage. So, your actions are a manifestation of your intention. Your intentions are informed by the value you recognize within the event or the individual or the entity or the issue, or the false value you have ascribed to the individual or event or issue based on foolish conditioning. If it's based on foolish conditioning, you'll have a foolish, misguided emotional response, and then you'll manifest foolish behavior. If it's properly defined, then your thoughts are rooted in reality, and your energetic responses are sound and intelligent, and then your behavior that are powered by those emotional energetic responses are sound and intelligent as well. And then the final phase is the harvesting or the seeding. You fully flowered, meaning you acted. Now there's the harvesting or seeding. The final stage in the unfolding of our behavior is the harvesting of the fruit of our labor, our action. We act in order to obtain a certain result, to affect a specific outcome. The results or effects of our actions are absorbed by us, and this absorption leads to new seed formation. It is a renewal of the cycle for our absorption of the results. The effects of our actions is the perception, reception of the results, effects of our actions. The perception or reception is the planting of a new seed into our awareness, and the behavioral cycle begins once again. It is a return to the first position. So the harvesting is after you have acted, now you harvest the results of your actions. If they were harmonious actions, then you benefit from that, the fruit of those actions. If they were self-destructive actions, then you harvest what you cultivate. And then what you cultivate, you utilize, but then the seeds fall from the cultivated fruit. The fruit falls from the tree. It's fully developed, it's fully flowered, the fruit is fully developed, and then it detaches from the tree. You eat the fruit, but then the seeds are planted back in the ground. So the cycle can begin again, and the seeding of perceptions begins again, and there's new behaviors that begin to form. So that is the cyclical manifestation of behavior. It's a cyclical process. Each one of those stages is actually governed by abosom when you're really engaged in real culture, when you're dealing with real ancestral religion or P, or so-called psychology in the real sense. You understand the unfolding of behavior in a cyclical fashion and the abosom who govern that unfolding of behavior. And when you're out of alignment with those forces in nature, then you engage in ritual practice to align yourself, realign yourself with those forces that govern you, those forces in nature that govern you, and therefore you attain your balance. All mental illness, all behavioral illness is a manifestation primarily, foundationally, of a disalignment of the sunsum, the spirit, from the Akrawa, the soul, the divine consciousness, the divinity that dwells in your head region. That force in nature that was assigned to you by the Supreme Being and encoded within that spiritual brain that dwells in your head region is the function you are designed to execute in creation and the specific configuration of energy you have been given to execute that function. As we say, if you're an immune system cell within the great divine body of the Supreme Being, then you are naturally inclined towards executing immune system function. If you get out of alignment with that function and seek to do something else, now you're disaligned from the divine function you were sent into the world, into the great divine body to execute. And therefore, that disalignment manifests as spiritual discordance or behavioral illness, mental illness. The root cause of mental illness is disalignment from the Kra, and the foundation for realignment is the foundation of the healing practice, the healing process. So this is what we're dealing with. All right, so let me see. Okay, we're going to take a couple of phone calls right quick. Okay, Michio on the phone line number.
Yes, my question.
1 second. Okay, on the phone line number 2081.
My question in regards to traders, people that in the Afurakani, either community or in general, if they, let's say, side with the beast and work with the beast, do their cross still intact or they're gone? I mean, I'm not sure. There has to be some form of not only repercussion if the community likes to take action, but also isn't there repercussion not only in the physical, but also in the transition stage? First question.
Okay. Now, the beginning part again, you said if they interact with the beast, with the white snare spring, is there repercussion? But what kind of person did you say in the beginning?
Well, it's like any type of punch because we know, in general, most of our people will side with the beast one way or the other and will play in their own self-destruction, either working with them or doing align with themselves to, hurt the community and other factions, either by, a form of betrayal. And it could go broad in betrayal. It could be physical. It could be verbal, all types. That's what I'm trying to elaborate. I don't know if I want to be more deep, if you want me to be more, and deep in the question.
Okay, I understand that. It's very similar. Like if somebody is aligning themselves with the Achiwadifo the whites and their offspring, who are Achiwadefo, meaning spirits of disorder, divinely prohibited and so forth. If you align yourself with spirits of disorder, and you're deliberately and consciously aligning yourself with disorder, then you will place yourself in disorder. It's no different than if you begin to consume drugs. You're placing yourself out of harmony with order, and you're engaged in disorder, and you're going to suffer the effects of engaging in disorder. Whether you do that with drugs, whether you do it with diet, or if you do that with spirits of disorder, the whites and offspring, you align with them, you interact with them, you engage them on a regular basis, then you're engaging, you're embracing disorder. You're trying to ingest disorder. You're creating a disturbance within your own spirit body on a consistent basis. And as long as you're holding on to that, no different than as long as somebody constantly ingests cocaine and so forth, they can say, well, but I'm doing my spiritual work. But you're at the same time ingesting cocaine. So you're contradicting everything you're doing. You're engaged in spiritual work to align yourself. And as soon as you finish doing that, you go back and engage in something that's going to cause disalignment. And you go back and engage in alignment and disalignment. So you're constantly in disorder. No different than someone who, eats very healthy on a daily basis in the evening, and then in the morning they eat things that are totally self-destructive. But then they turn around and say, well, I'm working out, I'm eating well tonight, and they get up in the morning and they drink alcohol or something like that, or whiskey or something like that, or put things in their body that are self-destructive. As long as you're embracing disorder on some level, you're going to remain in that disordered state until you make the conscious decision to reject disorder and its purveyors consistently, or else you're going to continue to be in disorder, whether you're in the physical world, or you make your transition, or you reincarnate and come back once again.
The next question I had to ask is, in terms of the Greeks, who labeled and given these Achuafo Greeks? Was it our people, or they call themselves or label themselves these terms called Greeks, or etc.? These terms they label themselves. Where it came from?
Well, yeah, they gave them they gave themselves these various titles, and you'll find sometimes such titles are corruptions of earlier titles, but once they become corruptions, then we're not claiming these corruptions, right? So even when you have, for example, if you have Horus, we know that's a corruption of Heru or Haru, but we're not going to continue to say, well, since it's corruption, then we're going to use it anyway and just call the divinity Horus, because that's not his name. And those vibrations don't align with that divinity. And it's the same thing with Greek, or it's the same thing with Roman, or even with Rome. We understand that, the NHOMA, Ramit is a title of the people itself. Like, people are coming from the teardrops of the eye of Ra. And the divinity, if you look in the so-called Nesli Mem Papyrus, and they talk about Atem and so forth, the Book of Knowing, the manifestations of Ra, of overthrowing Apep, and they talk about, people coming into being from the divinity Rem and becoming Remu and so forth, the teardrops from the eye of Ra, and you look at the Book of the Cow of Heaven and so forth, and they talk about people coming from the eye of Ra and so forth, the teardrops from the eye of Ra, teardrops from the sun, talking about the Ba, divine living energy that's within us. The Ba, that golden fiery energy and so forth, comes directly from the sun, which is the transmitter of that divine living energy of Ra. So our Ba comes from the great Ba. So when we come from the eye of Ra and so forth, they're talking about the sunlight, all of that. But Rem and Remu, talking about the teardrops of Remu, the deity's name, the eye is Rem. When the people call the land Rome and the people Romans and so forth, this is where it comes from. It doesn't come from Romulus and Remus and so forth. It comes from them corrupting the title of Remu and Ramu and ancient Kemet. But we're not going to start calling ourselves Romans because, the whites and offspring corrupted a title of the people and began to utilize it. And we wouldn't, some black people say, well, we named the Greeks and the Romans. We did not name them. They used corruptions of titles and other things. So that's, once they begin to corrupt things, that's their corruption.
And the final question I'd ask, in regards to the call that talked about sexual energy and how to utilize it, don't you have publication that brings out the actual real truth of how to utilize it in far more fashion than what is already out there that people sit there, read and digest, like the tantras and these other perversions that's out there?
What we have when we deal with that is the Ubin Shang, the Ancestral Summon, and then we also have a two-part video series where we go through the Ubin Shang, the Ancestral Summon in detail, piece by piece. One of the particular sections in the Ubin Shang, we mentioned that creation is ritual incarnation, which is one of the sections in the Ubin Shang, and it deals with the sexual energy at the end of it. We talk about that briefly there, but then we expand upon it when we go through the video series where we're going through that section. So that's one. And then also when we, the multi-part series on the Akradin Bokum. So we have an article on each one of those 11 divinities, deities that govern the 7 days of the week. And when we get into the section about Afi, the Abosom Afi, what's called Heteru and Oshun and everything, as well as the Abosom Amen Men, those two divinities primarily, then we're talking about the procreative activity or sexual activity as well in those two articles. And then we have broadcasts on those divinities as well, where we go through those documents in detail in the broadcast to bring more clarity to the document. So if people check out the Ubin Shang, Creation is Ritual Incarnation, as well as the video associated with the Ubin Shang, where we explain the book, and the Akradin Bosom, the Abosom Afi, so-called Heteru, and the Abosom Amen Men, those two articles on the Akradin Bosom page, as well as the videos associated with those two articles. You can get that information.
All right. Is there any way you could drop it on the chat room, or the chat room's closed right now? On the app part, you talk about the open name.
Okay, yeah. In fact, I'll put it in there now. Akradin Bosom page. And you still should be able to see, at least in the chat room. Yeah, it popped.
All right. Well, all my questions have been answered. Appreciate it. Medase.
Okay, Medase. So we want to go through the chat room right now just to make sure we didn't miss anything in the chat room. Just give me a second right quick. And as we go through this, well, in fact, there are quite a few comments in the chat room. So in the meantime, we're going to take another call on the phone line. Okay, Michio, greetings on the phone line, number 1112. You got a question or a comment? Number 1112, you had a question or a comment on the phone line? Okay, and there's a question in the chat room. And the question is there anything, excuse me, that aligns with Maslow's hierarchy of needs from an African perspective? Yes, in reality, exactly what we did last night on the Akradin Bosom and the Karu, the 7 Karu, or the so-called 7 chakras, that's actually the hierarchy of needs. And then, of course, what they took from the hierarchy of needs, they took from the so-called tree of life, which is really a major corruption of different aspects of the Posjatu, different collections of divinities in ancient Kemet. They're dealing with 10, but of course there are different collections. You have the 8 divinities of Kemenu and the 9 divinities of Anu and the 42 ancestors of Ma'at and the 4 children of Heru and 11 divinities as laid out, the company of divinities in the Meru text, pyramid text, and so forth. So on one hand, it's corruption of that, but primarily it's a corruption of the way the chakra system has been put forward by the Weisner offspring in the Western Hemisphere. All he did was take from that information, utilize, Western interpretation, kind of dumb it down, and put it forward. So you look at that hierarchy of needs, you look at that structure, and then you look at the structure of the so-called chakras of the Karu, or the Kasa, the 7 Kasas, the 7 nuts, and so forth, from the root to the crown, and you'll see that hierarchy of needs all the way going up to self-actualization and all of that is stolen directly from that. So when we talk about the actual nature of the Kara last night and the abosom that govern these different chambers, these different shrines and so forth within the spirit body, that is from the Afurakani, Afuraitkaitnit perspective. Okay. And we just want to make sure we didn't miss anything else in the chat room. And we have another phone call on the phone line. Okay, Michelle, number 5096. You had a question or a comment? Okay. Hold on one second. Oh, sorry, that was the wrong. My bad. Wrong call. Okay, just wanted to make sure we didn't miss that. Something going on with the chat room. All right. Okay, so there was a question. Well, there were actually 2 questions. We want to make sure we didn't miss that portion. How do we assist our weak elderly family with these discarnate spirits? So you have family members, blood relatives, whether it's elderly or others. If they're blood relatives connected to you, connected to the same Nsamanfo, then the way you assist them is through, of course, through your shrine, your Nsama and Komre, through your ancestral shrine, by evoking them and evoking them for that purpose of protection and for guidance on how to assist and bring that kind of information to your other relatives, your blood relatives, connected to those same ancestresses and ancestors, because they have been trying to communicate with them all along anyway, and they haven't been responding. So then when you go to your Nsamapo, on one hand, for them to send some energy of protection, but at the same time to give you guidance on how to interact with these individuals, and then you get that kind of information, get that kind of guidance, and then you go to your family members and share that information directly with them. Now, what you're saying verbally, externally, is what they have been hearing internally, spiritually, all along. Now it's a confirmation, even if they were neglecting it. When you come forward and start speaking and giving certain kinds of guidance, information, direction, then they have to begin to recognize and reflect, wait a minute, this is what I've been hearing all along, this is what I've been feeling all along. Maybe this individual is really communicating with them Nsamanfo because they've been trying to push me in this direction all along, and now here this person comes forward and says the same thing externally, what I've been hearing internally, even when they weren't around. So that begins to prompt them, provoke them to move forward and begin to try to engage some ritual practice on their own and help their, development. But yes, you can always go to the Nsamanfo, your spiritual family, your ancestors and ancestors, for assistance and protection for other direct blood family members. Okay. Okay, and there was a question about, can you touch on embracing another individual? Hold on one second, chat room jumped down. Embracing another individual in hugging and how receptive an individual may be, or how a receptive individual may be affected. So, yes, so it depends on the level of receptivity. And you can always relate it to the physical body. and depending upon somebody's level of physical soundness, their physical immunity. If their physical immunity is sound, then they have the capacity to repel toxins, repel bacteria without effort. And if somebody is sick or has the flu or something in the house or at work or at school or something like that, and they're coughing all over everybody, the person with a strong immune system can repel that virus, repel those toxins, and won't have a problem where everybody else is coming down with the flu. Even if they have someone at home, and, married to somebody and sleeping next to the person, they're coughing and everything, but the other person doesn't get sick because their immune system is strong. But if their immune system is compromised, then they can be infected with that virus, and they will come down with that congestion and everything else. The same thing is true of the spirit body. If there's a compromising of the spiritual immunity, then the people who normally can repel negative entities or the influences from negative entities and repel their energy, repel their projections, repel their recommendations, their suggestions, and so forth. If your spiritual immunity is compromised and you're not focused, then you will receive that. And that's just from them communicating and projecting. And of course, if somebody hugs you and so forth, and they have that kind of negative energy, then, they can influence you, and you can feel that pressure and that negative energy as well. And that pressure affects your physical body, but it also affects your spirit body as well. And you can feel that pressure and negativity as well. And if you're too receptive or your aura is too porous, then it'll negatively affect you. Just like somebody pushing you or causing some injury and so forth. But if you strengthen your aura, strengthen your, spiritual immunity, then you can repel that, and their provocations won't have any effect on you. But yes, whether they don't have to be touching you, they can just be in your presence, and they're constantly projecting, even on a very mundane level. When somebody is controlling the mind of somebody else, like someone's a battered spouse and so forth, they can feel the pressure mentally of the individual, and they're about to make a certain decision, and they become gripped with fear because they know that individual is going to do something, and their mind is still controlled by that individual, and the individual can be somewhere at work or something and still controlling the movements of that individual. But once they break free from that person's control, then they can freely operate and make decisions and so forth. And that's just on a mundane level. Of course, if you're in somebody's presence, whether they're touching you or not, if your spiritual immunity is not sound, then their energy can provoke you and have an influence, push you around and so forth. Okay, and Yenia said, I saw the comment about the Tepi series. Yenia said, we're going to publish that information as well. We just wanted to put it out with regard to the broadcast as soon as possible, but we are going to publish some more detailed information about that. Some of it we published inside the Anidaho book that we published, but we're going to publish more. Okay, so we just want to make sure. Okay, and Yenia Seda in Jideka, we saw that comment there as well. Just want to make sure we didn't miss anything else in the chat room. And it looks like we got everything, apparently. Okay. All right. So it looks like we got everything we were trying to get to there. And with regard to the, very quickly with the AFURA whole life interventions piece, we did go through that information in a previous broadcast. So what we'll do right now is simply show its application. And if you go to the Sankofa Juma website, which is a separate website that we have Odwirafo.com, but we also have Sankofa Juma. And this is connected with the training, the Adechere page. You'll see the AFURA whole life interventions piece. On that, you also see the in-chain document principled adaptability, individual treatment plans in the cultural spiritual domain. So that information is dealing specifically with human services agents, whether they're psychologists, psychiatrists, social workers, case managers, and so forth, utilizing individual treatment plans, the cultural domain or the spiritual domain, the different titles for that, must be utilized. If you're going to deal with the entire being, the whole life of the person, Afurakani, Afuraitkaitnit person, then you must include physical soundness and spiritual soundness from the center of culture. That's what we deal with in our NKWAMUA Whole Life Journal. AFURA Whole Life Intervention Therapeutic Model is the means by which we engage that process. That is a 5-step process. It replicates the cyclical unfolding of life as expressed through the Per Ankh, which we just read from, that unfolding of behavior in a cyclical process. We utilize that cosmogram, the seeding, rooting, sprouting, flowering, and harvesting cosmogram. We utilize that in a therapeutic model, the AFURA Whole Life Interventions model, to convey information about culture in a therapeutic intervention with our clients so that they can incorporate their positive, self-discover and incorporate their positive inherited ancestral values, recognize them, embrace them, incorporate them, and then transfer those skills to various aspects of life so they can bring balance to different aspects of their lives. So we don't have to go through the entire piece, but when you see the actual image, you see what we're talking about. It says, what we say in the document, the colored circles within the cosmogram reference the cardinal positions of the sun in its apparent cyclical movement. They also reference the seeding, rooting, sprouting, flowering, and harvesting cycle of plant life replicated in the 5 steps of AFURA, which is analysis, facilitation, underscoring, realization, and adaptability. Assisting our clients, Afurakani, Afuraitkaitnit clients, to incorporate positive inherited cultural values through employing the AFURA process prompts the unfolding of their awareness. Our clients are thereby empowered with a whole life approach to address the circumstances of a life. So, for example, you sit with a client, the first step is seeding. We talked about that earlier. It's an analysis of ancient Afurakani, Afuraitkaitnit ancestral values. And we've done this, of course, with numerous populations from children to adults, people with Axis 1 diagnoses and so forth, all of that kind of thing, in a therapeutic setting, whether it was in the home or at the office. So, and then we also show people how to incorporate these interventions in their progress notes and everything for funding sources and to capture these interventions in their documentation. So, you're dealing with a client. You want to address the whole life of the individual, not just, hey, what's going on, what's wrong, hey, you need to have some self-esteem, hey, you can't let them bother you like that, why did you start acting like that? Beyond all of that, we recognize the cyclical unfolding of behavior connected with the plant cycle, the seeding cycle, seeding, rooting, sprouting, flowering, and harvesting. And you can figure out in the cycle that the person is at. And you can see if there are disruptions in that point in the cycle and make adjustments. So you can recognize where they're at, where they're going, where they just came from based on the point in the cycle where they are. You have a proper assessment. And of course, when you understand ancestral culture, you know what Abosom govern these different aspects of the cycle, as well as Nsamanfo. So you have knowledge that can assist you in your therapeutic intervention. So the first step is seeding, analysis of ancient Afurakani, Afuraitkaitnit ancestral values. So say you gave them a Dinkra symbol and showed them, one of them, for example, we give in our NKWAMUA Whole Life Journal. We will use that journal to implement this AFURA Whole Life Intervention therapeutic model. Use it with individuals who thought that they hated anything African. They want to have nothing to do with nothing African, nothing cultural. The word cultural is repulsive to them. But there's a way to convey this information that even the people who think that they hate anything cultural and they hate themselves, the manner in which you convey it, 100% of the time they're on board with it. And many people don't understand that until they actually do it, and then they realize, even people who are quote-unquote seasoned, quote-unquote therapists, and you say, well, we have an approach to incorporate ancestral culture. They think they've already seen that before, and they're like, oh, no, this is not going to work. Oh, I've been doing this for years, it's not going to work, because you didn't have a real holistic system. You may have read about somebody saying, well, psychology comes from ancient Egypt, and they changed a few words around and threw a little philosophy around and talked about the Yoruba tradition and stuff like that, but they weren't really engaged in a holistic system of therapeutic intervention based on a model rooted in ancestral culture that they've actually utilized. They're just throwing some words around and talking about some philosophies and blackening up certain ideas, or pointing out when the whites and their offspring have stolen certain ideas, but they don't have a method rooted in ancestral religion, because most of those individuals are not practicing ancestral religion, so they don't see the holistic aspect of it. They're just throwing out Afrocentric trivia and calling it a process. And of course, that typically does not work. Some people, it will stimulate them just because they heard something ancestral. It's enough to stimulate them and make them want to look into it more, make them motivated. But many of our people, it's a cyclical process. And once you approach it in a cyclical fashion, then you can affect them at a root level. So the first step is, say you gave them information or showed them the information about the Adinkra symbol Shewo and She. That's the seeding process. An analysis of ancient Afurakani, Afuraitkaitnit ancestral values. Shewo and She means they try to burn you and you do not burn. That means you're indestructible. Nothing can destroy you. If you set fire to some leaves, they will burn up. You ask the person, what would happen if you set fire, took a lighter and lit some leaves, they would burn up. Some dry leaves, if you took that same lighter and lit a rock, what would happen? And they can tell you right away, well, the fire is going to go out because the rock is, quote unquote, unburnable. So when we see the symbol Shewo and She, it reminds us of our nature as unburnable, indestructible. That's the nature of our spirit. So you show them that ancient wisdom. And like, oh, I'd never seen that before. Then that's the seeding. The next piece is the rooting. The rooting is a facilitation of the client's self-discovery of innately held value, root value. So you show them that information, but then you ask them if they have a situation in their lives that reflects that. Have you ever been in a situation where you thought you weren't going to be able to overcome a certain thing, but then at some point you manifested the will to overcome it? And they always have some example of some situation that they were able to overcome when they thought at first they weren't going to be able to overcome it. Or even if they don't bring forward an example, they may be shy or something like that. You say, well, you're a client. The fact that you're sitting in front of me right now is a manifestation of that principle. Because some other people who are suffering for one reason or another, they did not seek to get up and go get some help from somebody, and they're still suffering in the gutter somewhere where they are, smoked out, drinking, doing whatever they're doing, or suffering with some behavioral illness and just suffering and thinking there's nothing they can do about it. You got up, came to see somebody, even if you were court mandated, adjudicated, and so forth, to come and see somebody or not, you still came, and you're sitting right here. That's a manifestation of the fact that you were not broken. You're unburnable. And once, whether you tell them that or they give you their own story, typically they will give you their own story about what happened when they thought they were not going to overcome a situation and they were able to overcome that situation. That's the rooting. Now the sprouting, the yellow circle, you underscore the identity of the client's innately held root values with the ancient ancestral values. You show the parallel between what the story they just gave you that they manifested in their own life and show how it's directly connected to the ancient ancestral values of Afuraitkaitnit. They're living these values and didn't even realize that what they were living are these values. You underscore and show the connection. Then there's a flowering. That's the next stage. A realization of the root ancient values as a direct genetic inheritance, inborn and indestructible. So not only did they manifest those same values, so this is not just something of, hey, here's an Adinkra symbol, this comes from somebody on the continent, this is a nice little proverb. No, you just proved to me that you actually lived these principles. And you proved it by telling me the story of something that happened to you before I ever met you. So you fully lived this principle of She, Wo, and She. They tried to burn you, but you do not burn. You are indestructible. So I don't have to tell you that's what you are. You just proved it because you have life experience that verifies that. Now we underscore the connection between your life experience and the ancestral value. And they see, oh, it is the same thing. The next piece is the flowering, the full realization that these root values that you hold and you operate on by instinct, it's not just a happenstance. You didn't just happen to stumble upon that kind of behavior. It is inborn. It is indestructible. It's from your direct genetic inheritance. It comes directly from your ancestresses and ancestors. Our ancestresses and ancestors during enslavement were indestructible. If they were not, then you wouldn't be alive because they would have died and they would have never had children. They would just succumb to the torture, never survive, never had any children. Those children wouldn't have had children, and so forth. So you're directly descendant from the ones who survived. What about the people who didn't survive? They didn't have children. Those potential children didn't have children. So there are many empty spaces around all of us as Afurakani and Afuraitkaitnit people in this country. There would have been people standing here, but some of those people died because they were not able to make it through. But we are descendant of the ones who actually survived. So that's proof of a direct genetic inheritance of this notion of She, Wo, and She indestructibility. So that's a realization. And once a person realizes that the fact that they, by instinct, that innate, inborn instinct to overcome obstacles is not just a happenstance, it's actually a direct genetic inheritance from their direct blood ancestresses and ancestors. The final piece is harvesting. Harvest with the fruit of that knowledge. Adaptability. Adaptability of the root ancient values to address present life circumstances inclusive of racism and so forth. So now that you know that this is within you and it's an inherited ancestral value, now it can be adapted to not only overcome that situation you already told us about, but it can be transferred to other situations in life so you can overcome those obstacles as well. The reason you can transfer it now is because you know it's something that's part of you, it's part of your culture, it's part of your nature. It wasn't an accident or a happenstance or luck that you utilized that capacity to overcome an obstacle in the past. It's part of who you are. So now that you know it's part of who you are, you can utilize it and adapt it to every other situation in life. When you have an obstacle, you can utilize that same firepower to overcome that obstacle as well and transform your life. So that's that cyclical manifestation. And once they go through that process, you gave them ancestral wisdom, then they self-discovered that ancestral wisdom operant in their own lives even before they met you. Then you showed the connection between their life experience and that ancient ancestral wisdom. Then the next piece is you show and help them to realize that the reason why there's a connection between their life experience and that ancient wisdom is because it's part of our direct genetic inheritance. It's part of your nature. And once they understand that, then the final piece is, if it's part of your nature, then you can utilize that same skill to overcome other obstacles in life and better your life in every aspect, formative. And once they leave that session, now they will begin to utilize that skill and recognize they have a power within them to overcome any obstacle, and it's proven. It's not you sitting there telling them, hey, look in the mirror and say, I love myself and I want to build up my self-esteem. You don't have to do any of that nonsense. Tell them the truth about who they are and what capacities they actually have, and let them show you that they've lived and manifested these capacities, and let them realize and help them to understand that they can utilize those skills in every aspect of their lives, and then they can transform their lives. This is an AFURA whole life intervention process. This therapeutic model has been used for that process to help people overcome various kinds of issues. And of course, you can go further when people get involved in ancestral culture fully. This is just for the average person who's not involved in anything ancestral. This is enough to transform the direction of their lives and put them on a proper path at therapy, as opposed to a pseudo-therapist. You can deal with this on a basic level and put them on a proper path whereas other therapists are still medicating people and misinforming them and giving them pseudo notions of, elevating their self-esteem and all this other nonsense and pseudo little exercises, put them on a fast track to overcoming their obstacles and enhancing their lives. With this, when some individuals begin to engage in ancestral culture, then they begin to learn about the abosome and everything else, and that further transforms what they're doing. So that's that process. So, and of course, that's on the Sankofa Juma page, website. So we're going to end it here. It is 11:52. Yedase for tuning in to the show once again. We will be back on tomorrow for NKWAMUA Marketplace. Look out for the notification for that, and please continue to share. For if you'd like to download our books, our 16 books, the e-versions are all free downloads for all 16 of our books. So you can check those out. If you would like to order the soft cover versions of our books, we print them in-house and in color on our own printers. We control all of that. We don't send them out to a third party for printing. They range between $8 and $11, and any order of 10 books or more is automatically 30% off. So some people order the first 10 books, it's 30% off, so therefore 10 books for $66, $6.60 per book, 30% off. So, and some people order the whole set. So, yet I'll say for those who have ordered, if you support the work that we're doing, we also have an institution that we already have an institution, but we're working to establish a physical space for the institution we already have. So we have a fundraising campaign for that. But any purchase of one or more of our books assists with our fundraising campaign. Anyone who makes a donation of $15 or more, we will send you one or more of our books in return for your donation. So just let us know. When you go to the publications page on our website, and you see all the various books, you can download them for free. You can order the soft cover versions, as well as you can make a donation if you would like. Any order $15 or more, you'll receive one or more of our books. Just let us know when you make the donation which book or books you would like to receive for your donation. And yet I'll say we thank you for support. And also check out the FEKU page, the Nanasom study groups page. You can form a study group with one or more people in your city, physically or as well as online. Anyone who forms a study group or becomes part of a study group, and these are your own independent study groups. When you order, we have a curriculum starting with our publication, The Kuku Tuntum, The Ancestral Jurisdiction. Anybody who forms a study group of FEKU or is a member of one, you can order those books at 30% off as well. So see that on the website as well. Connect with us on Twitter as Ojirafo, and Ojirafo on YouTube, Ojirafo on Instagram, as well as on Facebook. And you can also connect with us on our Afuraitkaitnit.com, our separate social network where people are studying the same information and interacting and networking here and around the world, our people, of course. So, yet I'll say we thank you for tuning in and supporting our efforts. We will be back on tomorrow for NKWAMUA Marketplace Day. Yebeshia Dio, we will meet again. That's us.